Tonight we are standing on the mountain where Semyaza led the Watchers into ruin, not to thrill at their descent, but to listen for the regret that old stone still seems to remember. And the ancient memory does not preserve only the fall. It preserves the place, the ridge, the oath, the night air where a sacred height was changed by a word that could never be taken back. So come slowly, dear pilgrim. Before we rest, we will keep one quiet watch on the mountain that remembers. If you have heard the story before, you probably remember the headline version first. The sons of heaven saw, they desired, they descended, they swore, and the world below became heavier. But tonight, we are not beginning with the daughters of men in the valleys, and we are not beginning with the giant sons who would later make the earth groan. We are beginning higher up, where the cold carries farther, where speech seems to travel with greater moral weight, and where a mountain still stood in the dignity of height before rebellion asked it to bear another meaning. That matters, because in the old sacred imagination, a mountain is never just a scenic object. A mountain is a threshold. A mountain is an exposed place. A mountain is where distance becomes visible. You climb a mountain to feel proportion again. You climb until villages look small and the sky looks more serious than your own thoughts. You climb because height can purify attention. That is why Hermon must be approached with reverence before it is approached with sorrow. If we begin too quickly with the crime, we fail to understand the place. And if we fail to understand the place, then Semyaza's regret becomes only psychology. But this title does not promise us mere psychology. It promises us regret inside a sacred geography. It promises us the leader of the Watchers in relation to a mountain that keeps memory differently than the human mind does. So let us come near the height first. Not racing, not dramatizing more than the text gives, only walking the lower ascent as night gathers around the slopes. There are stones here that would have held the last warmth of the day. There are places where the path narrows and the body adjusts without speaking. There are small sounds that belong to mountain night, the brush of wind against sparse growth, the faint settling of loose gravel, the way silence on a height is never total, only thinner and more awake than the silence of a room. And farther below, too far down to distract the eye, the earth lies in its ordinary human arrangements. Villages, dark roofs, tethered animals, last lamps, late bread, sleeping children, water jars cooling near walls. The old world does not yet know how much one mountain can matter to its sorrow. Hermon, the name in the old tradition, is bound to the oath, because there, the Watchers swore and bound themselves by mutual imprecations. Some hear in the mountain's name the echo of devotion, dedication, or devoted place. Others emphasize the way tradition has remembered it through the act committed there. What matters tonight is not forcing one neat lexical certainty, but feeling how terrible the reversal is. A height fit to teach reverence becomes the remembered site of collective trespass. Personally, dear gentle seeker, I always feel a special sadness when holy architecture is not destroyed from outside, but misused from within. That is Hermon's wound. Perhaps that is why we must begin below the ridge rather than upon it. A pilgrimage that starts at the wound too quickly rarely understands the innocence that was lost there. Hermon did not rise from the earth for this. It stood before the oath. It held snow, stone, light, weather, distance, and all the patient silences of creation before rebellious will press another memory into it. The mountain's first meaning was not conspiracy. Its first meaning was height, and height belongs to God before it belongs to any creature who dares misuse it. This is one reason the opening must stay liturgical rather than sensational. We are not here to relish the fall of angels, as if transgression becomes more beautiful when committed from a dramatic location. We are here to let the mountain recover its moral seriousness. A sin in a field is one thing. A sin on a height that should have tutored reverence is another. Place does not change evil into a different species, but place can deepen the tragedy by showing how much holiness was available before it was refused. Imagine climbing in the last blue of evening. The path is not impossible, but it asks enough of the body to quiet unnecessary thought. Your breathing changes. Your attention narrows. The lower world recedes without disappearing. The horizon widens, and with each rise of the ground, the feeling grows that you are moving toward a place where words will not remain light. That sense belongs here. This title needs it. Semyaza's regret is not the regret of a man after an impulsive act in a crowded city. It is the regret of a leader on a height, a leader who turned altitude into accomplice, a leader whose speech did not vanish into air but settled onto a place that would be remembered by others long after the speaking. So before we meet him directly, let us keep watching the mountain. Night on Hermon is unlike the safety of a household dark. Household dark wraps. Mountain dark exposes. Household dark draws walls closer. Mountain dark makes distance more severe. Even the stars feel different over a ridge than over a courtyard. In a courtyard, they may seem companionable. On a height, they seem judicial, still beautiful, still creaturely, yet somehow more exacting, because nothing between heaven and earth softens the relation. You stand beneath them with less protection from your own scale. That is why Hermon is not merely background for the watcher's story. It is pressure. It is witness. It is stage only in the weakest sense. In the stronger and truer sense, it is a place that asks what creatures intend when they come so high. Do they come to adore? To receive? To obey? To stand smaller before what is above them? Or do they come to use the height for another purpose? That is the question already forming before Semyaza appears in focus. And because this is a Night Watch script, we must not hurry past the forming of the question. The title itself depends on waiting here. If we rush to the oath, regret will seem like a later emotional penalty. But if we stay with Hermon before the vow, then regret begins to look like something else. Not merely pain after wrongdoing, but the unbearable knowledge of what a place once offered before you misused it. I think that is closer to the truth. Place matters because holiness and trespass both happen somewhere, and Hermon already rebukes the will approaching it from below. And that is why the approach matters so much. A mountain can wound memory even before action begins, because the soul already knows what kind of place it is misusing. Hermon is not merely where the vow will happen. It is where reverence was available and refused. The path upward has been teaching that from the first stones onward, by the time Semyaza reaches the ledge, the mountain has already offered warning, proportion, and a cleaner way of standing beneath heaven than the one he is about to choose. Maybe that is the hidden detail that changes the whole atmosphere tonight. Semyaza does not lead the watchers into ruin from nowhere. He leads them from a place already teaching the opposite of what they choose. The stone says limit. The height says proportion. The stars say order. The cold says seriousness. The distance below says responsibility. Everything about the mountain says do not turn this into appetite bound by oath. And yet the story moves in that very direction. There is also something deeply human in how we approach this scene. Most people think regret begins after consequences become visible, but often regret begins earlier, though only in seed form. It begins in the place itself, in the way a threshold feels wrong even before one crosses it, in the way a room seems altered before a sentence is spoken, in the way air turns morally heavy while events still appear almost calm. That kind of foreweight belongs here. We are not yet at the ledge. We are on the approach. And already Hermon is preparing the conscience for what the title promised us. Not merely a bad decision, not merely a mythic rebellion, but a leader's future regret, seated in a sacred place, before the oath has even hardened desire into shared ruin. Dear seeker of truth, keep your steps slow a little longer. Do not imagine torches and noise if the text has not given you torches and noise. Do not imagine theatrical wings and cinematic thunder if the old witness has given us something graver than spectacle. Imagine instead the starkness of a ridge not yet occupied by the full memory it will later carry. Imagine a mountain waiting to discover what creatures will do with its height. Imagine the last moments before place becomes accusation. This is where our first station ends. Not at the oath. Not yet. Only at the final stretch of ascent, where Hermon still belongs wholly to the dignity of sacred height, though the will that approaches it is already preparing another use. The next station must bring us onto the ridge itself, because title and place now require it. We have honored the mountain before the wound. Now, we must stand where the air thins. The valleys fall away, and the height itself begins to feel less like scenery, and more like a threshold between obedience and trespass. Why does this mountain feel less like scenery, and more like a threshold between obedience and trespass? Now we have reached the ridge. Not the whole summit in some triumphant sense. Not a conquering high place. A watchline, an exposed shelf of stone, where the world below can still be seen in fragments and the sky above no longer feels decorative. This is where title and place tighten around each other, because Semyaza's regret belongs to a leader on a ridge, not simply to a figure in memory. And the ridge is a particular kind of place. It is narrow enough to make gathering morally vivid. It is open enough that nothing softens the relation between creatures and heaven. It is high enough that choice no longer feels casual. I think that matters more than we sometimes admit. Many stories of rebellion are told in abstract moral vocabulary. Disobedience, desire, pride, transgression. All of that is true. But tonight the ridge asks us to feel those truths spatially. Here the body would know what theology later explains. Here feet would sense exposure before doctrine names boundary. Here lungs would tell the truth that serious places make of serious acts. What you do in a place like this seems to echo more than it would elsewhere. That is why this station must breathe for a while before it teaches. Let the ridge come into focus. The stone is colder here than below. The wind does not need to be violent to be searching. A person standing on an exposed line of rock at night can feel that the world is larger than private thought, and that private thought is therefore a poor measure for moral reality. Perhaps that is one reason the old sacred world loved high places as places of prayer and warning. They stripped away the illusion that creatures are self-defining. Even silence is different here. Below, silence often gathers out of enclosure. Here, silence gathers out of openness. It is not made by walls. It is made by scale. There is a humility in that kind of silence when it is received rightly. There is terror in it when it is not. And somewhere inside that tension, the ridge begins to show us why Hermon could never be only a location pin in the Watcher's tradition. It is a place whose physical properties intensify moral proportion. The air itself seems to say that what happens here will not remain local. Threshold. A threshold is not merely a line between two places. It is a charged place of approach, decision, and altered relation. Ancient people understood thresholds better than modern people do, because they lived nearer to doors, gates, ridges, borders, and holy precincts. To cross was not always to move only physically, it was to enter another order of meaning. That matters tonight because Hermon's Ridge is a threshold between realms in more than poetic language. The most dangerous trespasses are often committed in places already, warning the soul that it is about to cross more than distance. If that sounds severe, it should. The ridge is severe. Beautiful? Yes. But beauty on a height is not soft by default. There is beauty that consoles and beauty that clarifies. Hermon at this station clarifies. It lets the watchers see the earth below without letting them pretend the earth belongs to them. It places them under the stars without granting them equality with the order above. It holds them between domains, and that betweenness is exactly where creatures most need obedience. Semyaza will soon prove that betweenness can also become the birthplace of rationalization. Before that happens, though, linger with the ridge itself. Perhaps there are places where the stone breaks sharply enough that one must watch each footstep. Perhaps there are ledges from which the valleys appear as dark, folded regions, punctuated by a few last signs of human settlement. Perhaps the cold enters the hands first. Perhaps speech, when it comes, sounds slightly altered, as words often do in open night. All of this matters because place carries part of the burden of the story. This title asked for regret, and regret becomes sharper when one remembers not only what one chose, but where one chose it. A crowded hall can diffuse responsibility by noise. A battlefield can confuse responsibility by urgency. An exposed ridge offers neither excuse. It gives no crowd to hide in, no domestic confusion, no accidental haste, only gathered will under a serious sky. And that is why the ridge feels almost judicial before any verdict is announced. It has the plainness of a place that will not flatter self-deception. Some viewers may expect this station to become immediately dramatic with angelic movement and oath speech. But the wiser path is to let the ridge teach before the actors dominate it. This is one of the differences between spectacle and sacred environment. Spectacle uses place as ornament. Sacred environment lets place frame conscience. Tonight we choose the second path, because if we do not, Semyaza's regret will later sound too modern. It will sound like mere emotional aftermath, but the ridge tells us otherwise. It says, the place itself would have been remembered in the regret. The angle of the stone, the cold in the air, the open line of the sky, the severe visibility of the valleys below. That is how memory wounds when leadership turns wrong. It does not remember ideas only. It remembers surfaces, distances, weather. The exact quality of silence before speech hardened everything. Night watch in ancient sacred life was never only military vigilance. It could also be prayerful waiting, liturgical timing, or a disciplined attendance to what the night reveals and conceals. This is why the word watch is so useful here. The ridge feels like a watch place, but the question is, what kind of watch is being kept? A holy watch keeps reverence. A corrupt watch keeps appetite company until it can be made communal. Personally, I think titles like this become truer when we let that contrast remain sharp. And there is something almost tragic in how suitable the ridge would have been for the opposite story. One can imagine a company of beings standing on this height in humble praise. One can imagine the same winds serving adoration, the same stars deepening obedience, the same distance below awakening protective care for the human world, the same exposure curing rather than feeding pride. That counterfactual possibility is part of the sorrow. The ridge was not morally empty. It was rich with holy alternatives. A place becomes more tragic when it offered enough beauty to support reverence and was still enlisted for rebellion. That is why the mountain feels like more than scenery. Scenery does not accuse. Scenery does not grieve. Scenery does not hold alternative meanings that creatures refuse. Hermon does. It stands here as a threshold between obedience and trespass, precisely because it could have held obedience so fittingly. The exposed stone could have carried prayer. The open night could have carried awe. The watchline could have carried guardianship. Instead, it will carry oath. And once oath enters the ridge, the place will never again be innocent in memory. Notice too how leadership behaves differently on a ridge. In a hidden room, a leader can manipulate through intimacy and secrecy. On a battlefield, a leader can manipulate through urgency. On an exposed height, a leader manipulates through interpretation. He tells the gathered company what this place means now. He lends speech to desire. He gives structure to inward trespass. He converts private willingness into shared resolve. This is where Semyaza is moving, though we are not yet focused fully on his face. The ridge itself is teaching us what sort of leadership this will be. Not accidental, not chaotic, interpretive, architectural. He will help the others agree not only on an action, but on a moral framing of that action. That is why the ridge belongs to the title. Regret is heavier for leaders who did not merely join evil, but organized it. And perhaps the ridge also reveals why he feared to act alone. A serious place can expose hesitation. It can make even rebellious will aware of the scale of what it intends. It can stir the knowledge that to cross a threshold like this without companions would be to bear undiluted responsibility. The ridge does not yet speak that aloud, but it prepares the listener to understand why mutual oath will soon matter so much. A leader frightened by solitary guilt often seeks collective binding. If all are bound, then burden is spread. If all descend, then no one remains merely witness against the others. Shared oath becomes a counterfeit shelter against the loneliness of responsibility. That is not true shelter, of course. It is only multiplied ruin. But the ridge helps us feel why it would tempt. Exposure makes cowards inventive, and moral exposure above all. So stay here one moment longer, dear pilgrim. Let the night ridge hold its exact shape in your mind. Do not fill it with unnecessary fantasy. Let it remain mostly stone, sky, cold, distance, and gathered possibility. That spareness is enough. In fact, it is better than excess, because excess would distract from the real drama of this place. Not spectacle, but threshold. Not noise, but the terrible dignity of an exposed height waiting to learn whether its silence will be answered by reverence or by a vow. This is the second station's gift. It teaches us why Hermon feels less like scenery and more like the narrow edge where desire asks for speech, and speech is about to make a rebellion communal. A ridge like this also alters time. Down below, time is measured by tasks, by meals, by doors opened and barred, by the ordinary sequence of a village settling into night. Up here, time feels suspended between decision and witness. Minutes lengthen. A pause can seem to gather the weight of an hour. That is one reason the ridge sharpens conscience. It does not let intention pass quickly. It stretches the inward moment until creatures must feel what they are about to authorize. I imagine the company standing in that strained delay, not restless in the way of men in a marketplace, but taut with a quieter expectancy. No one can pretend the place is casual. No one can claim the height has given no warning. The stars above the ridge do not hurry them. The cold does not excuse them. The valleys below do not invite possession. Everything remains as it was created to be. And that steadiness only deepens the wrongness of what the gathered company is preparing to call resolve before the first binding word leaves their leader's mouth tonight. Even before the oath, the ridge feels burdened by a future it has not yet received into its stone. The next station must therefore tighten further. No longer the ridge in general, but Semyaza upon it. No longer exposure only, but the silence within the leader before he turns inward trespass into shared ruin. That is where we go next, to the figure on the watchline before the word leaves his mouth. What kind of silence lives in a leader just before he turns desire into shared rebellion? Now we come to Semyaza, not yet as a figure of later terror, not yet as the remembered leader of a bound company descending into violation. Tonight first, as a presence on the ledge, and because this is a sacred place script rather than a simple dramatic retelling, we must let the mountain remain around him. If we rush into his mind without the stone, the wind, the exposure, and the waiting company, then we lose what the title most needs. Semyaza's regret is not detachable from where he stood when leadership hardened inside him. So see him first in relation to the ledge. He is not floating in myth. He is standing somewhere. The ridge still holds beneath him. The air is still thin. The valleys below still remain what they are, sleeping human regions not yet fully conscious of what the height above them is preparing. And around him are others whose presence changes the texture of silence. A leader alone can still imagine he is merely thinking. A leader among the waiting company knows thought is almost over. Speech approaches. Decision approaches. Interpretation approaches. That is the kind of silence this section must honor. Not peaceful silence. Not innocent silence. Charged silence. The silence of a threshold where one sentence may organize many wills. Semyaza. The traditions preserve the name in forms like Semyaza, Semyaza, or Semyaza, and scholars continue to discuss exact etymological nuances with care. What is safe to say tonight is that the name has come down to us as the leader's name, the one most associated with the fear of bearing guilt alone and with the demand that the others bind themselves by oath. That leadership association is the key emotional truth for this station. A leader is remembered not only for what he desired, but for the moment he gave desire a structure other people could enter. There is something almost unbearable in that. Private sin is heavy enough. Leadership in sin is heavier because it enlarges the field of consequence. And Semyaza seems already to know this before the oath is spoken. That is one of the most haunting things about him. He is not remembered as a leader who blundered without awareness. He is remembered as one who feared the burden of acting alone. That fear reveals that conscience is not absent. It is present enough to seek company in transgression. That makes this station morally more interesting than a simplistic villain portrait. He is not innocent, but neither is he mindless. He appears in the tradition as someone who knows the gravity well enough to dread bearing it singly. And that dread is precisely what will make him bind the others. On the ledge, then, Semyaza is not merely a desiring being. He is a leader, trying to solve the loneliness of guilt by distributing it. That is an ancient temptation. If I cannot avoid the wrong, perhaps I can avoid bearing it alone. If I cannot keep my desire private, perhaps I can make it collective. If the act is grave, perhaps shared speech will make it feel inevitable. This is how leadership deforms. It takes inward willingness and gives it communal architecture. It builds a shelter that is not really shelter at all. Standing on the ledge, he would know more than any of the others that once speech leaves his mouth, the ridge changes. That is why his silence matters. This is the last place inside the story where his role still exists in possibility rather than enactment. The mountain has not yet been used in the most terrible way. The others have not yet been bound by mutual imprecations. The descent is not yet carried into history. He still stands before his own leadership becomes irreversible speech. And the title asks us to remain there long enough to understand regret as something seeded before action, not merely harvested afterward. What kind of silence, then, lives in him? I think it is layered. There is desire, yes. The tradition does not hide that. But there is also calculation, and fear, and anticipatory burden, and the cold knowledge that if he leads, he will become not only participant, but origin point in memory. The old texts do not need to spell every inward sensation out for us to feel the contour of it. A leader who insists on an oath has already admitted something very revealing. He knows the act will be costly, and he does not trust the others to remain committed if the cost is borne one by one. That tells us as much about his silence as any imagined monologue could. He is standing at the edge of unshared responsibility, and he is preparing to flee from that edge by making a company of it. Mutual burden. One of the darkest features of collective rebellion is that it can masquerade as courage while actually serving fear. The oath will sound bold, but part of its hidden logic is dread. Dread of solitary blame, solitary exposure, solitary memory. Ancient texts are often wiser about group psychology than modern people expect. Tonight that matters because Semyaza's silence is already full of communal strategy before communal speech begins. Personally, dear pilgrim, I find that more chilling than open rage. Rage is obvious. Organized fear can sound almost calm. Look at how the ledge intensifies this. He is not speaking in a valley market where noise could blur intention. He is not persuading in a crowded court where politics might diffuse the moral line. He is standing on an exposed oath place where every word will feel cleaner, harder, and more memorable because the setting strips away distraction. A mountain can make speech seem monumental even when it should have remained unsaid. This is one reason sacred places can be so terrible when misused. Their inherent seriousness lends false dignity to wicked resolve. The ledge does not endorse him, but its exposure gives his eventual words a carved quality in memory. That is why Semyaza's regret later belongs not only to consequence, but to recall. He would remember where he stood, the angle of the ridge, the cold on the skin, the open heaven above, the company waiting for him, the silence before he chose to make his fear a covenant. And perhaps that is what leadership often regrets most bitterly. Not only what happened after, but the exact moment when one still had the option to refuse the role of organizer. There is also the sorrow of how near obedience remained. This is important because if disobedience feels inevitable, regret becomes shallow. But if obedience remained near, available, fitting, consonant with place, then regret becomes deeper because it knows what could still have been chosen. Hermon does that to the title. It keeps obedience nearby in the imagination. The mountain still preaches proportion. The stars still preach order. The exposure still preaches humility. The distance below still preaches responsibility toward the human world. Nothing in the setting requires the vow. Everything in the setting warns against it. That is what makes the leader's coming speech such a wound. It is not uttered in confusion alone. It is uttered against a place already teaching the better way. Ledge. A ledge is smaller than a summit and more dangerous in its moral symbolism for that reason. It is not the place of fulfillment. It is the narrow strip where one must decide how to proceed. Tonight, the oath ledge matters because Semyaza's leadership occurs not at the broad completion of ascent, but at the dangerous edge where desire seeks a path downward while still clothed in the seriousness of height. Many ruinous decisions are not made in the center of a life, but on a ledge, narrow, exposed, and one sentence away from a direction that will be hard to reverse. Maybe that is why I do not imagine him shouting. Not yet. This station feels quieter than that. A dangerous quiet. The kind in which others are waiting for one voice to tell them whether private willingness will become collective law. If he had remained silent longer, perhaps some part of the company might still have fractured. If he had turned back, perhaps the mountain would have kept only its first dignity. If he had spoken against the thought forming among them, perhaps Hermon would have become a testimony of refusal rather than complicity. Those possibilities do not save the story, but they thicken its sorrow. The ledge still held alternatives, and a leader is often most tragic, not when alternatives are absent, but when he chooses to narrow them for everyone else. The company around him matters here too, though only as pressure at the edges. Their waiting sharpens his role. Leadership is rarely just interior impulse. It is impulse felt under the expectation of others. He can feel them ready. Ready, perhaps, with desire. Ready with fear. Ready with curiosity. Ready with that terrible kind of anticipation that hopes someone else will do the speaking necessary to turn impulse into act. So Semyaza's silence contains not only his own struggle, but the burden of gathered expectancy. That is part of why his regret later deserves a place-led telling. The mountain, the company, the ledge, the height, and the waiting all pressed upon the moment in which he chose to become more than participant. He became the one who gave the company a common mouth. And once a leader gives a gathered company a common mouth, history changes. And perhaps the most haunting part of the moment is that leadership still looks small from the outside. No armies move, no earth shakes, no verdict has yet been announced. There is only one figure on a ledge and a company waiting near him. Yet that is often how history bends first. Not with noise, but with one voice consenting to become the hinge for many others. Semyaza's silence is therefore full of scale, hidden inside apparent stillness. The mountain knows it. The ledge knows it. The waiting company senses it, even if they do not yet call it by its final name. A leader about to speak can already feel the future gathering around his mouth. That is why this station lingers so carefully. The mountain is still offering him one last unspoken mercy. The mercy of refusal. The mercy of remaining only a creature beneath heaven instead of becoming the mouth that organizes revolt for the others. That is why this station must remain exact. We are not yet at the oath, but we are at the brink of the voice that will make the oath possible. We are not yet in the descent, but we are at the place where dissent is becoming morally organized. We are not yet in the full ruin, but we are at the silence in which ruin is being granted a leader. Dear companion, stay here one moment longer before the word comes. Feel how narrow the ledge is. Feel how open the sky is. Feel how the mountain's own severity would have made obedience beautiful if it had been chosen. Feel how fear of solitary guilt is preparing to dress itself as bold companionship. And feel, above all, how regret has already begun very quietly. Almost invisibly, not because the consequences are visible yet, but because the leader still stands in the exact place where he might have refused to become the angel who led the Watchers into ruin. Our next stop will not let the silence hold any longer. The word must come. The oath must be spoken. And the mountain itself will be changed when Semyaza turns this exposed ledge from a place of warning into the remembered threshold of shared rebellion. How does a mountain change when forbidden desire becomes spoken vow? The word comes here, not in a crowded hall, not in the confusion of a city, not under the pressure of immediate battle. Here, on the exposed oath place, on Hermon. That is what gives this station its severity. We are no longer on the approach, and we are no longer only studying the ridge. We are standing at the exact place where Semyaza turns inward willingness into shared speech. The title Promise tightens here because this is not merely the beginning of a bad act. It is the moment when leadership lays hold of place, time, fear, and company all at once and gives them a single direction. The tradition is clear enough on the point that matters most. They swore, they bound themselves, and the mountain carried the memory. That is why the station must move slowly, even now. It would be easy to narrate this as a burst of dark resolve, as if the whole thing happened in one theatrical surge, and then the ridge was already behind them. But speech in sacred places does not disappear so quickly. Words spoken on heights seem to remain in the air longer, not because the air physically keeps them, but because conscience does. The one who speaks remembers the place. The ones who consent remember the place. And those who hear of it later remember the place because the story never learned how to tell the oath without telling Hermon. The old witness preserves mutual imprecations, a binding of the company into one shared undertaking. An oath is not merely a statement of intention, it is intention hardened into witness-bearing speech. In scripture and related traditions, oaths are dangerous precisely because words matter before God. Tonight, that matters because Semyaza does not simply suggest rebellion, he seals a company within it. Appetite becomes much more destructive when it learns to speak in covenantal forms. Evil often borrows the architecture of faithfulness in order to make unfaithfulness feel strong. That borrowing is part of what makes the scene so painful. An oath should belong to truth. An oath should strengthen fidelity. An oath should bind creatures to what is righteous. Here, the form remains solemn, while the content rots from within. That is one of the oldest corruptions in spiritual history. Not open chaos first, but the misuse of holy structure for an unholy end. Semyaza, then, is not simply choosing badly. He is liturgizing rebellion. He is taking the grammar of solemn commitment and draping it over trespass. That is why Hermon changes the moment the oath is spoken. The mountain is not transformed in its stone composition. The snow does not suddenly darken. The ridge does not physically split. The stars do not vanish. But meaning enters the place differently. A sacred height has been used to authorize a shared refusal of creaturely limit, and once that has happened, the place cannot be remembered innocently again. This is the moral change the station asks us to feel. Hermon becomes a witness place, not because it agreed, but because it was made to hear and hold what should never have been said there. Imagine the company gathered close enough that silence itself has become communal. No one is merely thinking now. No one is only waiting. They are listening for the words that will turn a private interior trespass into a collective identity. And Semyaza speaks. We do not need to embellish the exact wording beyond what the tradition has preserved in substance. In fact, restraint helps. Because what matters is not ornamental dialogue, but the moral architecture of what he does. He names the act, names the risk, names the company, and refuses to bear the burden alone. That refusal is crucial. It reveals again that he knows what sort of act this is. He may not yet know the full scale of future ruin, but he knows enough to seek insulation through solidarity. That is how the oath becomes doubly dark. It does not only bind the others, it shields the leader emotionally through distribution of guilt. If all are implicated, then no one need stand alone beneath the first weight of consequence, or so rebellion tells itself. But collective guilt does not lighten moral reality, it widens it. The oath, therefore, changes not only the mountain, but the company itself. Before the oath, they are many wills hovering near one transgression. After the oath, they are one will moving toward many consequences. That difference matters. A temptation in private remains dangerous. A temptation given common speech becomes history. This is why I keep returning to the mountain as more than background. Hermon is not simply where the oath happened. Hermon is the place that reveals how great the theft is. The higher and clearer the place, the more obvious the misuse of sacred form becomes. Had the same decision been made in a confused and lesser setting, it would still have been evil. But here, its evil acquires a sharper contour because it was uttered where reverence should have been easiest. The phrase sounds strange to modern ears, but its severity is useful. An imprecation places a weight upon the speaker, invoking consequence if the pledge is broken. In this way, the Watchers do not merely agree casually, they summon the solemn logic of self-binding. That is why the scene feels almost anti-liturgical. The outward seriousness resembles covenantal gravity, but the direction is wrong from the beginning. Personally, dear one, I think this is one of the most sobering features of the old story. Rebellion does not always appear first as disorder. Sometimes it first appears as discipline bent toward the wrong object. Discipline bent toward the wrong object. That may be one of the clearest descriptions of the oath. There is order here, but it is cursed order. There is seriousness here, but it is misdirected seriousness. There is solidarity here, but it is solidarity against obedience. This is why the mountain changes. Not because noise overwhelms it, because solemnity is stolen on its slopes. And maybe this is also where regret begins to deepen in Semyaza, beyond mere anticipatory fear. Before the oath, his burden is mostly internal. Desire, dread, calculation, the wish not to fall alone. But once the words are spoken, the thing becomes exterior. It enters the world between persons. It exists not only within his motive, but within shared memory. He can no longer tell himself that nothing final has happened. The ledge has heard. The company has answered. The mountain has received the form of the rebellion. Words do that. They make inward things harder to deny. The chapter also helps explain why later tradition remembers Semyaza with a different gravity than the others. Leadership is not merely firstness. Leadership is formative speech. The leader is the one who supplies the company with a common mouth, a common frame, a common willingness not to retreat. If another Watcher had first broken rank in private, the story would still be tragic. But with Semyaza's oath, the tragedy gains architecture. The descent below will unfold through bodies and events. The oath is the design hidden underneath. And once a design exists, the future begins to narrow. That narrowing is part of what the mountain feels here. Before speech, alternatives still had breadth. After speech, the ridge itself seems tighter. The company has fewer paths. Not because God removed them, because they removed them from one another. Every shared vow narrows the field of easy retreat. Every communal pledge makes turning back more humiliating, more difficult, more morally expensive. Semyaza understands this, which is exactly why he wants the oath. He is not creating courage. He is making retreat costlier than rebellion. That is a terrifying kind of leadership, and a familiar one, if we are honest. Human history is full of leaders who take a gathering of fear, desire, vanity, or grievance, and then give it a binding form strong enough to outlive the participants' better judgment. Once bound together, people will often do in company what many might still have refused in solitude. The Watcher's oath is therefore mythic in scale and painfully recognizable in principle. Though the text does not use that exact modern phrase, the idea helps clarify the moment. A covenant in holy terms should align shared life with divine order. Here, the shape is retained while the direction is inverted. The company binds itself away from obedience, yet it borrows the seriousness of covenantal action to make that refusal feel stable. One of evil's oldest strategies is not to abolish form, but to inhabit form parasitically until creatures mistake solemnity for righteousness. Maybe that is why the mountain's silence after the oath feels different from the silence before it. Before, the silence was warning. After, it becomes witness. Before, the ridge still offered unclaimed dignity. After, dignity remains in the mountain itself, but not in what has just been done there. That shift matters because it is the first full answer to our station question. How does a mountain change when forbidden desire becomes spoken vow? It changes by becoming historical. It changes by becoming accusatory in memory. It changes because creatures have made it part of their moral story. I do not mean that the stone is morally stained in some magical way. I mean that the place can no longer be entered in remembrance without hearing again the misuse of solemn speech. Every sacred place has the potential to heal memory or to wound it, depending on what is done there. Hermon now wounds, not by its own will, by theirs. And yet I think the mountain also remains strangely noble in the scene. It does not bend to flatter them. It does not become their sanctuary in any true sense. It stays itself. Stone remains stone. Sky remains sky. Stars remain stars. Which means all the false dignity belongs to the oath, not to the mountain. That, too, is part of Semyaza's future regret. He did not transform the place into his own. He only used it badly. The mountain still belonged to God while he was speaking against God's order upon it. That is the humiliation hidden inside the power of the scene. Many rebellions imagine they have claimed the stage. In truth, they only borrowed it temporarily. Hermon never ceased to belong upward, even while it was being used downward. That should sober every creaturely act of trespass. No one sins on neutral ground. This is also the point where the company stops being merely gathered beings and becomes a fellowship arranged against obedience. There is a dreadful intimacy in that. Oaths do not only direct action, they create belonging. To be bound together in rebellion is to make disobedience part of fellowship itself. That is why the descent will later feel so difficult to interrupt. They are not just companions in motion now. They are a sworn body, and all of that began with one leader refusing to bear the first guilt alone. You can feel, I think, why the title names regret rather than pride. Pride is certainly present in the larger rebellion. Desire is certainly present. But regret is the most haunting lens here because Semyaza knows enough to fear the burden even before he creates it. That prior awareness makes the oath echo differently in the conscience. He cannot later say he stumbled blindly into leadership. He engineered the collective form precisely because he sensed the danger. That is why his name feels heavy on Hermon. He understood enough to dread solitary ruin and chose communal ruin instead. Dear listener of truth, remain with the ledge. One final moment before we move on. The oath has been spoken. The company is bound. The mountain has changed in memory. And yet there is one more thing the station gives us before descent begins in earnest. The first silence after the vow. Not the silence of possibility now, but the silence of irreversibility. Not the silence before a threshold is crossed, but the silence that settles after creatures realize the crossing has truly happened. That silence belongs to the next moment awaits. The ledge remembers this now, because regret rarely shouts first. Often, it appears as a change in the air after the decisive words are already gone. The first thing after the oath is not motion, it is silence. That may be one of the most overlooked truths in the whole story. People tend to imagine that once the vow is spoken, everything rushes forward at once, as if history could only express its seriousness through immediate movement. But there is often a terrible stillness after decisive speech. The word has gone out. The company has answered. Nothing remains technically unclear. And yet for a moment the body stays where it is, the mountain stays where it is, the sky stays where it is, and only meaning has changed. That is the silence we must enter now. Not long enough to become indulgent, long enough to let the title deepen. Because Semyaza's regret, if it is ever to feel more than literary ornament, must be rooted in this air. The sentence is no longer inside him. It has passed from will into sound, and from sound into witness. No later sorrow can erase that transfer. The ledge has heard it. The others have heard it. He himself has heard himself say it. That is why the first silence after the oath is not empty. It is loaded with what cannot be recalled. Ancient people did not imagine speech as disposable the way modern life often does. Words spoken publicly, solemnly, and before witnesses entered the moral world with consequence. Tonight the air matters, not because we are becoming mystical in a vague way, but because spoken vows inhabit shared reality. Some silences are not the absence of words, but the place where words begin showing what they have done. Feel how different Hermon must be now. The ridge has not moved. The stones have not cracked. The stars still hold their places above. But the mountain feels altered because the company upon it is altered. Before, each being still possessed a private threshold. Now, the threshold has been crossed together, and collective crossing changes atmosphere. Even among human beings, a room after an irrevocable decision carries a pressure unlike the room before it. One can sense that something has become real in the space between persons. The old ordinary arrangement is gone. There may still be quiet. There may even be outward composure. But underneath both, the moral air has thickened. That belongs here. Semyaza would feel it first, I think. Not because he is more innocent than the others, but because he is more responsible than the others. A leader hears his own words differently after they leave his mouth. Others may feel emboldened, steadied, bound, or swept forward by the company. The leader also feels the shape of authorship. He knows that what is now shared became shared through him. This is why the station remains so close to the place. Regret begins not merely in consequence, but in the leader's first experience of his own speech as external fact. Perhaps he feels the silence become heavier because it no longer offers him any refuge. Before the oath, silence still held alternatives. After the oath, silence becomes reminder. It says, the thing exists now. It says you have made a path wider for others. It says, the ridge will remember the turn even if no one speaks again for several moments. I imagine the company almost listening to the aftermath inside themselves. No one needing to ask whether the bond has taken. No one needing to debate whether they truly mean it. The words themselves have already done the work of arrangement, and that is the terror of solemn speech. It can create structure before motion appears. The descent need not yet begin visibly for the rebellion to have become historical. In a sense, history has already bent. The rest is consequence spreading through time. Not absolute irreversibility in the highest theological sense, since God remains judge and sovereign over all creaturely acts, but irreversibility in the moral texture of memory. A spoken vow cannot be made unspoken. A shared pledge cannot be made unshared in recollection. Tonight this matters because the silence after the oath is the first place Semyaza would feel that his power has already exceeded his desire. He has done more than want. He has ordered, and ordered acts live longer than impulses. There is something deeply tragic in the way solemnity can outstrip satisfaction. The desire that led to the oath may have seemed intense in advance, but once the words are spoken, the first sensation may not be triumph. It may be burden, not repentance yet, not clear horror yet, but burden. The body often knows gravity before the mind agrees to interpret it. A person can feel the difference between possibility and commitment, even if he refuses to name the difference clearly. I think Semyaza's first acquaintance with regret would have lived here in burden, without full confession. Heaviness without surrender. A changed relation to the place before changed relation to the self has been fully admitted. That is one reason the station is gentle rather than loud. Regret has not become eloquent yet. It has become atmospheric. The air is different. The ridge is different. Silence is different. And a leader who knows what he has done cannot entirely keep from sensing that difference, even if he pushes through it. Hermon as witness place. Places become witnesses when decisive acts are bound to them so strongly that later memory cannot separate event from environment. Hermon is one of those places in the Watcher's tradition. Not because the mountain judges by itself, but because it holds the scene in sacred geography. Personally, dear pilgrim, I think witness places are often more haunting than witness people. A person may forget, distort, justify, or die. A place remains available for memory to return to, and the return itself becomes a kind of accusation. Maybe that is why this station does not hurry downward. If we left the ridge too quickly, we would lose the first full birth of the title's grief. Semyaza's regret must begin here, or it will later feel added on. It must begin in the changed pressure of a place that has now heard him misuse solemn speech. Not all regret begins with tears. Some regret begins as a place becoming harder to inhabit. A room where one has lied in a decisive way feels different afterward. A threshold where one betrayed trust feels different afterward. A field where blood was first shed feels different afterward. And a mountain where a leader bound others into trespass feels different afterward. This is the emotional truth the station is carrying. The ledge is no longer simply where he stands. It is where he has made himself rememberable in the worst way. And memory, once tied to place, becomes difficult to outrun. There is also a communal dimension to the silence. The others have heard themselves consent. Whatever courage or solidarity they borrow from the group, they are now each sealed into the knowledge that the act has become common business. Even if some part of one or another had trembled inwardly before the oath, the company now supplies momentum. One reason shared rebellion is so dangerous is that it quickly generates its own emotional weather. After the vow, hesitation becomes more embarrassing. Doubt becomes more isolating. Retreat begins to feel like betrayal of the company rather than recovery of obedience. Semyaza has accomplished that with one act of leadership. He has turned private threshold into communal weather. That too belongs to the air. When I say the air feels different, I mean all of this. Pressure, collective arrangement, burden, memory, and the first almost imperceptible hardening against return. The night itself has not become evil. Creation remains creation, but the moral atmosphere among the gathered company has shifted so decisively that the same wind passing across the ridge now seems to move through a changed fellowship. Some silences protect. This one exposes. Some silences refresh. This one settles. Some silences leave a soul lighter. This one announces weight. Perhaps that is why the next movement downward is already present in the station before a foot lifts. Once a sentence cannot be unsaid, it begins to ask for embodiment. The oath has created a future that will press for enactment. That pressure may not yet be frantic, but it is real. The company cannot remain forever on the ridge, pretending nothing further is required. Bound speech seeks visible follow-through, and Semyaza would know that more sharply than anyone. The leader who arranged the oath also arranged the demand that the oath now be honored in action. He has trapped himself inside his own solution. He feared bearing the burden alone and so multiplied it. But multiplication does not free him. It only makes his authorship harder to escape. Burdened nearness. One of the most useful ways to describe this station is burdened nearness, the sense that consequence has moved closer even before its full shape is visible. The company has not yet fully enacted what it vowed, but it now lives in a felt nearness to that enactment. When people speak themselves into sin together, consequence often arrives first as nearness, not impact. The soul begins to feel the future before the future fully lands. This is why the station must remain patient. A dramatic retelling would rush from oath to dissent. A night watch retelling lingers with the altered hush. That hush is the first chamber of regret. Not complete regret. Not redemptive regret. Not yet the grief of seeing all that follows. But the earliest inward knowledge that the world is no longer arranged around the same possibilities it held a few moments before. If the ridge could have spoken in human language at this point, perhaps it would not have shouted condemnation. Perhaps it would only have felt difficult to breathe upon, difficult to stand upon, difficult to remain upon without sensing that speech had introduced an alien solemnity where a better solemnity once lived. That is how witness places accuse best, not always by noise, but by becoming atmospherically hard to inhabit. There is also the strange quiet in which a company begins hearing itself as a company. Before the oath, each one may still have been able to imagine a private reservation, a private escape, a private difference from the others. After the oath, even unspoken hesitation has to push against a newly shared identity. That is why the air feels denser. It is not only carrying remembered words, it is carrying a bond. The bond changes how each presence stands beside the others. Nearness hardens. Fellowship thickens. Solitude becomes more difficult to recover, even inwardly. A leader who has created that kind of nearness cannot fail to feel, at least dimly, the burden of having altered the moral shape of the whole gathering. And perhaps Hermon's own exposure makes the silence more honest than any chamber below could have made it. There is nowhere for speech to hide once it has been spoken on a ridge like this. It hangs in the open relation between earth and sky. It remains proportioned against stars, distance, and cold. A lesser place might have let the company feel immediately enclosed by its own excitement. Hermon denies them that comfort. The mountain does not join their vow. It only lets them hear it in the full severity of where they have placed it. That is part of the sorrow gathering around Semyaza now. He has gained the solidarity he wanted, but he has gained it in a place too clear to let solidarity feel innocent. That is why the silence feels so complete. It is no longer deciding. It is absorbing. The mountain absorbs the oath as witness place. The company absorbs it as shared identity. And Semyaza absorbs it as authorship. Nothing visible has yet widened into later catastrophe, but the first inward widening has begun. The future is already making room for itself inside the stillness. Even before anyone turns fully toward the lower paths, the air has become the first chamber in which consequence stands nearby, waiting to be carried further down the mountain. What had been possibility a moment ago had become atmosphere now, and atmosphere has a way of instructing bodies before minds admit the change. Dear soul of the path, hold that image a moment longer. The company still gathered, the words now behind them, and somehow still among them. The mountain unchanged in substance and changed in memory. The leader already unable to become pre-oath again. This is the silence after the vow, and from this silence, the descent must begin, not as adventure, not as spectacle, but as the carrying out of a future already planted in solemn speech. That is where the next station takes us, away from the ledge and down from sacred height, where wrongful descent begins to move from vow into enactment. What does descent feel like when it is no longer holy visitation, but chosen trespass? Now, movement begins. Not because the oath was insufficient, because the oath has done exactly what it was designed to do. It has made stillness temporary. Once the company is bound, the ridge cannot remain the whole story. Speech presses downward. The solemnity misused on Hermon seeks enactment below. And so the mountain, which should have been a place of upward attention, becomes the point from which downward trespass is organized. This is the beginning of the descent. And the word descent matters more than we often notice. Not all descent in sacred literature is dark. God descends in mercy. Glory descends in revelation. Word descends in nearness. Rain descends in provision. Blessing descends without violating order. That is why the Watchers movement must not be described carelessly. They do not descend as holy envoys. They descend against the grammar of creaturely obedience. Their movement borrows a sacred direction while emptying that direction of holiness. Descent. In biblical and related traditions, movement from above to below often carries symbolic freight. Descent can mean revelation, condescension and mercy, divine visitation, or the coming near of help. That is exactly what gives this station its moral dissonance. The Watcher's descent imitates a sacred pattern while violating its purpose. Evil often prefers parody to invention. It mimics holy movement because creatures are more easily deceived by familiar forms than by obvious chaos. Hermon intensifies that dissonance because the descent begins from a place that still belongs to God more than to them. Every step downward is therefore haunted by the contrast between true heavenly nearness and false crossing. They are moving through the right direction for the wrong reason. In a way, that is the story of much corruption. It does not always invent a brand new road. Sometimes it takes a road that once carried blessing and drives appetite along it instead. Imagine the first steps away from the oath place. The company loosens from stillness. Stone shifts underfoot. The ridge behind them does not disappear, but recedes. And with the receding ridge, the burden of enacted commitment grows stronger. They are no longer only a sworn company. They are a company in motion. Motion always reveals seriousness. Many inward rebellions survive by remaining hypothetical. Once bodies begin to move, the moral line sharpens. That is true for human beings as much as for the Watchers. There is a difference between desiring a threshold and crossing it, between fantasizing about trespass and walking toward its fulfillment. The descent marks that difference. It is the first embodied proof that the oath was not ornamental. Sacred height misused. A height does not become less sacred because creatures leave it badly. If anything, their leaving exposes the seriousness of what they have abandoned. This matters because the descent is not only toward the world below, it is also away from the immediate rebuke of place. They are moving from a space that clarified proportion into spaces where appetite may seem easier to justify. Personally, dear pilgrim, I think that movement is tragically recognizable. Many people move away from places that tell the truth too clearly and prefer environments where disobedience feels less naked. And perhaps that is why the slope matters as much as the ridge. A slope is not yet valley. It is transition. It is the long body of the mountain between high warning and lower enactment. This makes it the perfect place to think about the feel of wrongful descent. The company has left the vow place, but the vow remains fresh. The lower world is nearer, but not yet fully entered. The path downward carries the peculiar unease of actions that have begun but not yet fully landed. There is still distance enough to think, but not distance enough to reverse easily, not after the oath, not after the movement, not after the communal bond. Semyaza's regret must therefore deepen strangely here. On the ridge, regret was atmospheric, seated in altered silence. On the slope, regret acquires momentum. The leader feels not only what has been spoken, but what is now being carried forward under his leadership. Every step gives the oath a body. Every downward movement tells him that his fear of solitary guilt has successfully become a company's direction. He wanted companions. Now he has them. And that success is its own wound. There is often a bitter irony in sinful leadership. The very thing the leader seeks to avoid alone is achieved communally, and the communal achievement only reveals the leader's responsibility more starkly. If the watchers had scattered in uncertainty, he might still have hidden in ambiguity. But a company descending together under his lead makes the architecture of his role unavoidable. Parody of visitation. Visitation in holy texts often brings help, instruction, correction, or blessing. Here, the movement from height toward earth is a parody of visitation. The company comes near, not to heal but to transgress, not to guard but to take. That is why the descent must remain morally sharp in our telling. When a sacred pattern is mimicked for an unholy purpose, the very familiarity of the pattern can make the act appear grand, when it is actually a distortion. Do not imagine grandeur too quickly then. Imagine wrongness. Imagine a movement that has scale without holiness. Imagine feet, if one may speak that way of embodied movement in visionary tradition, carrying decision down a path that should have led to praise rather than trespass. Imagine the valleys below, not yet fully aware of what is coming toward them. That ignorance matters. The lower world has not consented. The human lands beneath Hermon are not partners in the oath. They are recipients of what the oath will release. This makes the descent more grievous than if the scene remained only celestial drama. Chosen trespass from above always has a destination below. The slope, therefore, joins heavenward rebellion to earthly consequence. It is the connective tissue between the bound company on the ridge and the burdened world in the valleys. And that is exactly why the station belongs so centrally to the title. Semyaza is not merely the one who spoke, he is the one whose speech moved others. Regret for such a leader can never remain only about the inward act. It must include the sight of others coming after him on the same slope. That sight would be almost unbearable if clearly faced. He is not descending alone. He has made descent social. He has given the company a common motion. And common motion always strengthens common resolve unless something stronger interrupts it. But no interruption comes here. Only the mountain, the slope, the company, and the tightening nearness of the world below. Threshold of enactment. The slope is where vow becomes enacted orientation. It is not yet the full arrival, but it is too embodied to remain only intention. Ancient moral wisdom often distinguishes between desire, consent, and act. This station sits between consent and full act, showing how quickly consent begins seeking bodily confirmation. Tonight, that matters, because it lets us feel the exact temperature of the descent, not yet consequence in full bloom, but consequence already leaning forward. Maybe the cold remains with them for a while as they move. Maybe the air begins to change subtly as altitude lessens. Maybe the stars no longer feel quite as judicial as on the ridge, because attention has turned more downward. And perhaps that downward turn is the truest sorrow of all. The mountain had been training the eye upward in proportion. The descent redirects the company toward taking from below. In that sense, the movement is not only spatial, but liturgical in reverse. Their attention is being trained toward possession rather than praise. This is why sacred place still matters even while they are leaving it. A holy environment can continue accusing creatures after they step away from its center. The memory of the ridge travels down the slope. The memory of the oath travels down the slope. The memory of what the mountain offered and what they refused travels down the slope. And all of that travels with Semyaza most intensely because he authored the common resolve. The descent is therefore not freedom from the mountain. It is the mountain's memory following him into action. That, I think, is one of the deepest truths of regret. The place where one first misused sacred seriousness does not always remain behind. It can accompany the next steps invisibly. A threshold crossed under the wrong spirit goes on interpreting later actions, even in new terrain. By the time the company nears the lower reaches, Hermon has already become more than origin point. It has become shadow. The oath has become shadow. The leader's first burden has become shadow. Everything below will now unfold under what was spoken above. A slope also has its own humility, and that humility is being violated here. Unlike the ridge, which confronts the gathered company with exposure all at once, the slope teaches through gradualness. It lowers the body by degrees. It gives time for reconsideration. It stretches movement into a series of small obediences to gravity. In a better story, that gradualness could have become mercy. It could have given the will space to break apart, to hesitate, to recover. But once the oath has done its work, the same gradualness begins serving another purpose. It becomes the long corridor through which bound intention travels toward its object. The mountain still offers warning with every step, yet warning and movement now coexist in painful tension. I think this is where parity becomes most visible. True heavenly nearness would descend without theft. It would approach the lower world in fidelity to the one who made both height and valley. It would not need an oath of fear to sustain it. It would not need shared guilt as fuel. The Watcher's motion possesses none of that peace. Their descent has urgency without holiness, resolve without righteousness, and shared direction without shared goodness. That is why the path itself feels wrong beneath them. The route downward is real, but the meaning moving along it has become corrupt. In that sense, the slope is almost like a sentence being physically pronounced one step at a time. And the lower they go, the more impossible it becomes to pretend that Hermon was only a dramatic beginning now left behind. Sacred places are not discarded so easily. Their memory travels with the trespasser. One can leave the ridge and still carry its accusation. One can descend the mountain and still hear, beneath all future justifications, the first seriousness of the place where obedience remained near. That is part of why regret often grows later, with such punishing clarity. The self remembers not only the act, but the holiness that stood nearby when the act was first chosen. Semyaza is descending with that memory already attached to him, even if he refuses to call it repentance. There is another gravity here too. The sight of others following. Leadership always changes once the leader can hear the movement of companions behind him or beside him. Their continued motion confirms his power and accuses it at the same time. If he alone had begun to descend, he might still have mistaken his act for singular folly. But a company on the slope under his arrangement turns folly into influence. He is no longer merely a will in conflict. He is a precedent in motion. Every step the others take is another commentary on the words he spoke above them. That realization would be enough to burden even a hardened leader. Because nothing exposes the cost of leadership like watching others embody your corruption. The slope remembers the ridge even while it leads away from it. Every downward turn repeats the fact that the company is carrying sacred place rebellion into earthly space. That repetition is its own accusation, quiet but relentless, under the night air. Nothing dramatic needs to happen yet, for the descent to feel condemned by the very path that bears it. Beloved soul, feel the slope as long transition, not merely a route, a moral bridge. The mountain still near enough to accuse, the earth below near enough to receive the harm. The company suspended between sacred warning and human consequence, and Semyaza in the midst of them, already discovering that what he organized on the ridge has become harder to escape with every downward step. Even the wind along lower stones seems to say that shared rebellion has found direction and will demand victims. The next place we gently arrive widens the frame. We will not enter the human household the way the Nephilim story did. Instead, We will look upon the valleys beneath Hermon from the vantage of what is coming toward them. The title now demands that we feel the lower world as sleeping ground beneath a broken height. What do the sleeping valleys beneath a broken mountain not yet know is coming toward them? Every mountain creates a below. That is obvious physically. But in stories like this, the below matters morally as well. A height can keep its own drama until one remembers the valleys lying under it. Then the scale changes. Then the rebellion is no longer only about what the Watchers did on Hermon. It becomes about what Hermon now overlooks, what it shadows, what its oath has released toward the unaware world beneath. This station must widen the frame without losing the place. We are still under Hermon's authority as setting, but now we look down, not in conquest, not in appetite, in grief, because the valleys below do not yet know what the company on the mountain has arranged. They still belong to ordinary human sequence. Doors close, fires lower, parents settle children, animals quiet, water stands in jars. The long, patient vulnerability of creaturely life continues beneath a height already carrying another meaning in the night. That contrast is one of the most sorrowful in the whole narrative. The mountain knows something the valleys do not. The ridge remembers something the households below have not yet felt. The company descending carries a future that the lower world has not consented to receive. Scripture often lets below signify not inferiority, but exposure, dependence, and earthly vulnerability under forces from above. Tonight, the valleys beneath Hermon matter because they are not merely scenery under a dramatic mountain. They are the human world into which the consequences of the oath will descend. Every proud height should remember that there are sleeping lives beneath it. From this vantage, the valleys are not yet sites of legend. They are homes, paths, wells, threshing places, folding walls, small enclosures, late bread and early waking, the ordinary grammar of human life. That grammar should remain in view, because otherwise the Watcher's story becomes too fascinated with itself. One of the oldest temptations in reading ancient rebellious beings is to let their scale swallow the smaller lives beneath them. But the lower world is not incidental. The lower world is why the oath matters. If no earth lay under Hermon, then Hermon's wound would remain narrower. But human valleys do lie beneath it. Sleeping lives do continue beneath it. That is where Semyaza's leadership becomes most terrible. He has not led a rebellion into empty air. He has led it toward inhabited ground. The phrase, daughters of men, has often been handled too abstractly or too sensationally. But from the mountain vantage tonight, it first means human women living inside ordinary households, ordinary seasons, ordinary bodily vulnerability. What matters here is not fantasy but scale. The immense wrongness of a sworn company from above setting its desire toward finite lives below. Personally, devoted pilgrim, I think the story becomes morally clearer the moment the valleys return to view. Perhaps from the slope or a lower lookout, the villages below appear only as interrupted darkness and scattered light. A lamp here, a roofline there, a little geometry of settlement held inside the folds of land. The mountain can see farther than those within the valleys can see upward into it. That asymmetry is part of the sorrow. Power often sees vulnerability before vulnerability can interpret power. The lower world sleeps within a trust it has not yet been given reason to surrender. And trust is one of the most defenseless beauties in creation. That is why this station must remain quiet. No screaming, no spectacle, only the terrible tenderness of not yet knowing. A child sleeping in one of the lower houses does not know that Hermon above has entered a different history tonight. A mother, laying aside the last task of evening, does not know that a mountain has been turned into witness place over her world. An elder, checking the weather, or the animal pens, or the stored grain does not know that the height above them has just been enlisted in a rebellion against order. This is where place deepens title better than plot alone could, because if the story were told only from the watcher's perspective, it would remain too elevated in the wrong way. The valleys pull it back to moral proportion. What do the sleeping valleys not yet know is coming toward them? They do not know that solemn speech has been used against them. They do not know that a company has bound itself upon the mountain. They do not know that the descent now underway will not remain a problem of Hermon only. They do not know that their ordinary human scale is about to become the very point of violation, earthward consequence. In biblical imagination, sin rarely remains in the realm where it first appears. It moves, it spreads, it passes from intention to relation, from relation to structure, from structure to the ground itself. This matters tonight, because the valleys beneath Hermon are where Semyaza's decision stops being only a mountaintop event and starts becoming earthward consequence. One measure of a leader's guilt is how many ordinary lives begin carrying the shadow of a decision they never made. That sentence belongs to this station. The shadow has begun. Not yet in full violence. Not yet in the later birth chamber of the Nephilim story. Not yet in the earth groaning under giant appetite. But in shadow, in trajectory, in the simple fact that a mountain oath now has a destination. The valleys beneath Hermon become heavy in imagination. Once you realize this, each lamp below becomes more than a lamp. It becomes a sign of unguarded humanity. Each path becomes more than a path. It becomes a route through a world still living by ordinary creaturely assumptions. Each enclosure, each threshold, each sleeping roof becomes a sign of how much trust the world contains before power teaches it fear. That trust is what ruins always injure first, not by destroying it all at once, by approaching it. There is also a hidden contrast here with true heavenly care. If beings from above had descended in obedience, the valleys would have been protected, instructed rightly, or left in peace according to God's order. But the oath on Hermon has redirected superiority into appetite. That is why the lower world matters so much. It shows what the Watchers should have guarded and instead moved to exploit. A mountain is terrible when it releases not blessing but trespass into the lands beneath it. And Semyaza, from this vantage, must begin to appear as more than the leader of a dramatic company. He is the leader of a downward threat to ordinary life. The farther the eye goes over the valleys, the harder it becomes to romanticize him. This is good. Titles like this can be mishandled if regret turns into glamour. We do not want that. We want moral clearness softened only by grief, not by fascination. Semyaza's regret is moving because he leads into ruin, not because ruin somehow makes him grand. The valleys beneath Hermon keep that perspective honest. They remind us what sort of world his leadership is moving toward. Human scale, human bodies, human houses, human mornings that do not yet know what night above them has prepared. Sleeping ground. Sleeping ground is a useful phrase for this station because it captures vulnerability without sentimentality. The valleys are not weak in a contemptible sense. They are simply earthly, finite, rhythm-bound, and unarmored against the specific kind of trespass now descending toward them. Personally, I think some of the deepest pathos in sacred storytelling appears when high rebellion is seen against sleeping ground below. Keep the viewpoint wide a little longer. Do not hurry to individuals yet. The title does not require domestic close-up here. It requires downward grief. It requires the leader's mountain decision to be seen in relation to the earth under his height. This is how sacred geography guards against abstraction. Hermon above, valleys below, oath above, unaware life below, shared resolve above, ordinary creaturely trust Below, the tension is almost unbearable once you let the whole topography appear at once. And maybe that is where Semyaza's future regret becomes most impossible to escape. It is one thing to remember the ridge where he spoke. It is another to remember what lay below while he spoke. The very sightline of the mountain becomes part of the accusation. He did not lead into blank distance. He led while the valleys were there. He led while roofs, wells, paths, mothers, daughters, and sleeping children were there. That is what the mountain looked out upon. That is what the oath ignored. And perhaps the most painful thing about the valleys is how little they need to do in order to be worth protecting. They do not have to become grand in order to matter. Their significance lies precisely in their ordinary creaturely dignity. A sleeping child matters without knowing theology. A mother matters without standing on a mountain of revelation. A well matters because thirst is real. A wall matters because exposure is real. The lower world does not justify itself by spectacle. It just lives. That is why Semyaza's leadership grows darker the more clearly the valleys appear. He has organized a movement not toward an abstract earth, but toward life already full of meanings he did not create and had no right to violate. This is also where distance itself becomes morally important. From above, the valleys can be seen in outline without their inhabitants being able to answer back. That imbalance echoes many later forms of domination. The powerful often look upon the vulnerable first as landscape, as arrangement, as reachable territory. But sacred storytelling resists that reduction by reminding us that every light below belongs to somebody. Every path below carries somebody's step. Every roof below shelters somebody's fatigue and hope. The downward gaze becomes less romantic and more terrible the moment personhood returns to the scene. Hermon does not overlook emptiness. It overlooks neighbors, unknown to the ones now descending from its wound. So when we ask what the sleeping valleys do not yet know, we are really asking how innocence continues for a little while, after danger has already been released toward it. The answer is painful. Innocence continues by habit. People finish the day. They trust the structures of ordinary life. They do not imagine that a sacred height above them has become the birthplace of an approaching corruption. In this sense, the valleys are not foolish. They are simply creaturely. And creatureliness without suspicion is one of the first things predatory power exploits. The station must keep that tenderness intact, because without it, the story becomes fascinated with the mountain and forgets what the mountain threatens. There is a further sorrow here. Valleys depend on heights for rain, sheltering boundaries, and the shaping of rivers. But they should never have to depend on heights for violation. Hermon was meant to stand over them as part of creation's order, not as the origin point of their dread. Once that contrast is seen, the mountain itself becomes a grief-bearing figure in the imagination, still noble in its making, and yet made terrible in memory by what its ridge released toward the people sleeping below. They sleep below still. A forged blade or an enchanted formula may seem far removed from the oath ledge, yet the tradition refuses to separate them. That refusal is wise. Techniques are never only techniques once they are taught within a moral rebellion. They carry the intention of the hands and mouths that transmit them. Under Hermon's shadow, instruction becomes an afterlife of the vow. Knowledge is no longer offered as stewardship inside divine order, but as accelerated leverage within a world being retrained to prize mastery. This is why the forbidden gifts feel so grave. They are not isolated curiosities. They are habits of power born from a mountain where creatures first agreed to act against the grain of holiness together. The next station must therefore name the long shadow itself. The mountain's wound does not remain a memory only. It begins to spread through teaching, technique, and the corrupted gifts that move from the Watchers into the world below. We go next, not to the archive table, but to Hermon's shadow, reaching into human history. How does ruin travel from a mountain, vow into tools, arts, systems, and habits on the earth below? The oath on Hermon does not remain only an event. It becomes instruction. That is one of the coldest truths in the Watcher's tradition. The mountain does not merely release bodies downward. It releases a curriculum. Once the sworn company moves from height into the world below, their trespass begins to spread not only through taking, but through teaching. And teaching always lasts longer than a single night. A vow can wound a place. Instruction can wound an age. This is where the mountain's shadow lengthens. Not because the sun has changed, because the consequences of Hermon now begin reaching into human practices, human systems, human habits of looking at the world. That is why this station must hold both geography and gift together. We are still under Hermon in moral terms. What is taught below is not separable from what was sworn above. The old text remembers specific forbidden arts, weaponry, metallurgy, adornment, enchantments, root cuttings, astrology, and illicit readings of celestial order. The deepest danger is not mere information, but misordered teaching knowledge detached from reverence and put in service of control, violence, vanity, and counterfeit mastery. A rebellion becomes historical when it learns how to educate. That line belongs here because it explains why Semyaza's leadership reaches far beyond the ridge. If he had only led a single transgressive act, the story would still be severe. But the tradition remembers more. It remembers a company whose descent altered the moral grammar of human life by giving power new techniques. In that sense, Hermon becomes not only the site of oath, but the upper source of a dark pedagogy. Let us stay with the mountain's shadow rather than move all the way indoors. Imagine the valleys beneath receiving not only presence, but arts, skills, methods, new ways of handling matter, new ways of reading signs, new ways of intensifying the human appetite for dominance, beauty detached from holiness, predictive control, hidden manipulation. These are not random details. They are the extension of the oath by other means. A company bound against obedience will eventually teach against obedience as well. And once teaching begins, the original mountain vow enters generations that never stood upon Hermon at all. That is how ruin becomes larger than its birthplace. Asael. Among the remembered names, Asael is especially associated with weapons, shields, breastplates, medals, and beautifying arts, antimony, and adornment. The combination is telling. Violence and surface enhancement appear side by side, the forge and the mirror sharing a dark intimacy. Tonight this matters because Hermon's shadow is not one-dimensional. The descent does not teach only killing. It teaches intensified power over bodies, surfaces, and fear. Personally, dear pilgrim, I have always found the pairing of weapon and mirror one of the most haunting notes in the tradition. It suggests a world increasingly trained to manage danger and appearance at the same time. That is not far from many ages, including ours, but the station must remain ancient in atmosphere. The forge opens under Hermon's shadow. Metal is handled with new ambition. Force is shaped. Defense and aggression are sharpened together. At the same time, the body's outward presentation becomes more manipulated, more consciously fashioned as surface. The world below is not merely becoming more capable, it is becoming less innocent in what capability is for. And that is the key. The forbidden gifts are not evil because knowledge is evil. They are evil because knowledge is severed from sacred proportion. Power is taught without obedience. Skill is taught without wisdom. Technique is taught without creaturely limit. That is the true shadow of Hermon. Barakijal, Kokabel, and the heavens misread. The tradition links certain watchers to the instruction of celestial signs, constellations, clouds, sun, and moon. The issue is not that creation is unworthy of study, but that study becomes exploitative and controlling when it is untethered from reverence. This matters tonight, because the heavens above Hermon, which should have instructed humility, are now being converted into a coded system of mastery for the world below. Wonder dies quickly when creatures learn to approach the sky only as leverage. That sentence helps explain why the mountain remains central even when the curriculum spreads outward. Hermon was the place where stars still looked judicial, where height still preached order, where the sky still carried moral seriousness. But once the oath is spoken and the descent proceeds, the very things that should have humbled the company become material for distortion. The heavens turn from liturgy to inventory. The earth turns from gift to resource. Hidden properties become shortcuts to power. What was meant to be received becomes something to extract. That is what a corrupted curriculum does. It retrains desire. It re-educates the imagination. It changes not only behavior, but what the world seems to be for. Under Hermon's shadow, then, human beings begin learning new relationships to matter. Beauty, violence, secrecy, and prediction. A rebellion that began as appetite on a ridge becomes a school beneath the mountain. That is more terrifying than a single act of trespass. An act may shock. A curriculum endures. A curriculum enters custom. It shapes generations who were not present at the oath and did not know the first solemnity from which their new powers emerged. Root cuttings and enchantments. The old tradition remembers hidden arts as well as visible ones. Root cuttings suggest secret knowledge of buried properties, while enchantments suggest manipulative speech aimed at gaining control beneath the surface of ordinary trust. Tonight, these details matter because Hermon's shadow reaches not only into open skill, but into subterranean desire, the wish to get underneath things, to command outcomes from hidden places, rather than live by faithful dependence. Personally, I think this is where the story becomes especially modern in its warning without ceasing to be ancient. And all of this belongs back to Semyaza, even if he is not the named teacher of every individual gift. Why? Because leaders are answerable not only for the first act they personally perform, but for the world their leadership permits. He organized the company. He supplied the common mouth. He gave the descent communal form. Therefore, the shadow of Hermon's teachings falls partly through him. This deepens the title exactly as it should. Semyaza's regret cannot only be about the first oath, it must also be about the long afterlife of what that oath released. A leader into ruin does not merely look back at one night. He looks back at an age his leadership helped deform. Shadow as sacred geography. Shadow here is not mere metaphorical darkness. It is the extension of mountain consequence into the lower world. Hermon casts more than physical shade in this station. It casts remembered origin, moral distortion, and the diffusion of a rebellion into culture. Some sins do their worst work not at the point of decision, but in the long shadow that follows the decision into other people's habits. That is why the station must keep the mountain faintly visible, even while the gifts unfold below. If we lose Hermon completely, then the forbidden arts become disconnected curiosities. If we keep Hermon overhead in memory, then each gift becomes another echo of the oath place. Weapons echo the mountain. Painted surfaces echo the mountain. Manipulated roots echo the mountain. Misread stars echo the mountain. Everything now bears the shape of a descent that began in solemn speech on sacred height. This is how place remains active in history, not by magical force, by moral origin. And perhaps this is where Semyaza's regret becomes almost unlivable if ever faced without self-deception. It is one thing to regret a rash act. It is another to realize you have helped change what a whole world learns to admire. Fear, make, and trust. Leadership into ruin rarely stays localized. It enters systems. It alters customs. It teaches future hands what to build and future eyes what to desire. The shadow teaches downward. Instruction now settles into the habits below. That is the true shadow of Hermon. The mountain above remains what it is in creation, but the world below has begun to inherit a different grammar because of what was sworn there. A valley at night has a tenderness a mountain does not. Sound is held differently there. Smoke settles differently there. Human life gathers into smaller circles of care and repetition. A valley shelters routine. It gives households a rhythm by which to belong to one another. That is part of what makes the view from Hermon so severe. The mountain looks down upon places, organized not for conquest, but for continuance. Bread, sleep, storage, repair, marriage, childbirth, animals, weather, inheritance, all the slow structures by which earthly life keeps going, lie beneath a height already burdened by a vow against order. The contrast between those two worlds should not be hurried past. The pairing of outward arts with inward corruption also deserves to be felt more fully. Weapons alter what bodies can do to one another. Adornments alter what surfaces can invite or conceal. Celestial readings alter how the future is imagined. Root cuttings alter how hidden properties are approached. Each gift reaches into a different layer of human life, yet all of them share one family resemblance. They promise intensified agency without first requiring sanctified desire. That is the shadow of Hermon in practical form. The world below is being taught how to increase capability faster than wisdom. Such instruction almost always feels impressive at first. Only later does it reveal how much reverence had to be stripped away to make it seem so desirable. This is why the station should not become merely condemnatory in a flat way. The ancient text is sharper than that. It understands temptation. The gifts spread because they answer fears and ambitions people already carry. Fear of vulnerability, fear of uncertainty, hunger for beauty, hunger for protection, hunger for control over what seems hidden in the world. The Watchers do not invent human longing from nothing. They exploit it. They intensify it. They tutor it away from dependence. And because Semyaza gave the company its common mouth at Hermon, every exploited longing below remains tied, however indirectly, to his first act of bound leadership. Regret for him, if truly faced, would have to include this tragic fertility of corruption. We should also notice how the gifts deform the relationship between heaven and earth. The heavens above were meant to awaken praise, timing, order, wonder, and trust in the Creator. The earth below was meant to be tilled, received, named, and inhabited in gratitude. Under the Watcher's instruction, both realms are reinterpreted. Heaven becomes a coded field for leverage. Earth becomes a storehouse of extractable force. Beauty becomes manipulation. Matter becomes armament. Knowledge becomes self-exaltation. This is more than bad information. It is cosmology bent out of shape. The oath on Hermon has become a way of reading the world wrongly. And once a civilization begins reading the world wrongly, almost every later disorder becomes easier to justify. That is why the mountain's shadow feels longer than the physical reach of evening. It stretches into forges, mirrors, calculations, charms, glances, ambitions, and fears. It enters social life. It enters power. It enters desire. A shadow like that does not simply darken. It educates. It trains the next response. It offers shortcuts where patience was once required, force where trust was once possible, prediction where prayerful dependence once lived. The terrible brilliance of the old tradition is that it sees corruption not only in spectacular acts, but in new defaults. Hermon's shadow becomes dangerous because it keeps teaching after the original night has passed. Another reason the gifts matter is that they teach imitation. Once the world below begins admiring what the Watchers introduce, people start repeating the logic without needing the original teachers near them. Violence learns craft. Vanity learns method. Curiosity learns domination. Fear learns techniques of self-protection detached from trust. In that sense, Hermon's shadow reproduces itself. It becomes a pattern in human culture. And that makes Semyaza's burden heavier still, because leadership into ruin is most devastating when it keeps echoing through people who never heard the first oath spoken on the mountain above them, while the ridge still remembers. Beloved companion, hold together both scales before we move on. The exact ridge where solemnity was stolen, and the widened world beneath where stolen solemnity now becomes curriculum. This is where the title grows heavier. Semyaza is not merely regrettable because he fell. He is regrettable because he led, and leadership made the oath fertile in the world below. The next station will turn us back toward Hermon itself as place memory. The gifts have spread. The curriculum has begun. Now, the question becomes whether a mountain can itself grow unbearable, because it keeps remembering what was done there and what has since unfolded beneath its shadow. What happens to a holy place when it cannot forget what was sworn there and what spread beneath its shadow? We return to Hermon now, not as tourists of ruin, not as collectors of mythic scenery, not even mainly as witnesses to the first oath. We return because the mountain has become memory. That is the burden turn this station must take. The forbidden gifts have already begun to spread beneath the height. The valleys are no longer merely sleeping ground in imagination. They are becoming the lower world, shaped by a vow that learned how to educate desire. And once the world below begins carrying the consequences of what happened above, Hermon itself changes again in remembrance, not in essence, not in stone, not in snow, but in what the place now means whenever it is beheld. A mountain can become harder to look at without becoming less beautiful. That paradox belongs here. Hermon remains lofty. Its ridges remain severe. Its weather remains clean in the old highway. Its distance still gives proportion. And yet beauty itself has become difficult because memory now accompanies sight. One can no longer imagine the ledges innocently. One can no longer think of the exposed height without hearing again the misused solemnity, the shared vow, the first downward steps, the sleeping valleys below, the curriculum of power spreading out under the mountain's shadow. Place and aftermath have become inseparable. Sacred tradition often binds memory to place so that geography becomes theological witness. Bethel, Sinai, Zion, Gilgal, Eden, Moriah. Each bears acts, promises, judgments, and nearness that later generations cannot remember abstractly. Hermon enters that field in a darker mode. It becomes a remembered height, not because God needed the place, but because creatures used the place against order. The heart rarely remembers sin as an idea only. It remembers rooms, roads, thresholds, weather, and the exact place where the soul became harder. That is what makes Hermon so haunting. If the story had no mountain, the rebellion would still be evil. But because it has a mountain, evil acquires contour. Because it has Hermon, regret acquires elevation. Because it has a place, the conscience has somewhere to return. And conscience does return. Even when a leader refuses repentance, memory keeps circling the place where the first seriousness was stolen. That is why this station must not merely repeat the oath scene. It must ask what it means for a place to hold the shape of an event long after the event has unfolded into history. Hermon has become more than location. It has become the visible form of a moral memory. Perhaps that is why some places in human life grow almost unbearable to revisit. A doorway where betrayal happened. A table where a family learned bad news. A street corner where violence erupted. A church where a promise was broken. A hillside where the self first chose to keep going after warning had already been given. The place does not change species, but it becomes charged. Every feature begins speaking. Every contour becomes commentary. This is how Hermon now functions in the title's deeper register. Semyaza did not simply use a mountain and move on. He made the mountain part of the future burden. He created a place to which regret could always be attached. That is a different order of sorrow from a hidden act done nowhere memorable. To sin in a place of proportion is to make proportion itself part of later accusation. Witness place after consequence. Earlier we spoke of Hermon as witness place when the oath was spoken. Now the idea must widen. A place becomes even more accusatory when later consequences confirm the seriousness of what happened there. What was once a warning remembered, only in principle, becomes a warning validated by history. Personally, dear pilgrim, I think this is one reason the mountain grows heavier in imagination as the story advances. After the gifts spread and the lower world bends, Hermon no longer remembers only intention. It remembers outcome. That is the crucial deepening. At first, the mountain heard a vow. Now it also stands over the world marked by that vow. At first it held speech. Now it holds aftermath. At first it witnessed desire hardened into oath. Now it witnesses the education of ruin beneath its slopes. The place has therefore become fuller in sorrow. A remembered threshold is painful. A remembered threshold with visible consequences is far more painful. This is why the station must keep looking both upward and downward at once. We must see the ridge that received the solemn words, and we must see the valleys that received the long shadow of those words. Hermon now joins those two scales. It is the mountain that remembers above and overlooks below. The topography itself becomes theological structure, and perhaps that is why the beauty of Hermon remains necessary here. If the mountain were ugly, the station would lose force. If the place were only sinister, the sorrow would flatten. But a lovely height misused is harder to bear than a corrupt place behaving corruptly. Beauty intensifies memory because it reveals what should have called forth reverence instead of theft. The cleaner the air, the worse the vow sounds within it. The clearer the stars, the more unbearable the distortion becomes. The steadier the ridge, the more unstable the creatures upon it appear. So Hermon is not merely dark. Hermon is beautiful in a way that exposes the darkness done there. That is why we return. The mountain as recurring accusation. Some memories accuse because they replay feelings. Others accuse because they present facts. Place memory often does both. The body remembers atmosphere, and the mind remembers action. Hermon's recurrence in the Watcher's tradition joins those two forms. It offers again the exposed cold, the clean silence, the judicial stars, and at the same time it presents the fact of the oath, the dissent, the shadow, the deforming gifts. The sharpest accusations are often the ones that do not need to shout because the place itself has become enough. Imagine, then, what it would mean for Semyaza to remember Hermon not only as the mountain of decision, but as the mountain he can no longer separate from all that followed. When he thinks of the ridge, he does not think of a single brave or terrible moment in isolation. He thinks of the path the company took, the lower world they entered, the arts that spread, the world that changed. A leader's memory of place is always heavier once his influence has matured into consequence. This is one of the great sorrows of leadership. Ordinary people may regret a night. Leaders often regret an era. Ordinary people may remember a choice. Leaders remember the structures their choice set in motion. That is why Hermon becomes almost unbearable. It is not just the mountain where he spoke. It is the mountain from which a whole grammar of disorder entered the world. And grammar is the right word now. The mountain remembers not just isolated wrongs, but a syntax of rebellion, oath, dissent, shadow, teaching, consequence, distortion, fear, vulnerability. The height has become the opening sentence of a long paragraph of ruin. Once seen that way, it cannot be seen lightly again. Sacred place misread. Sacred places do not guarantee holy use. That is one of the most sobering lessons in Scripture and in all related theological imagination. Humans and heavenly beings alike can misread a place by treating its dignity as available stage rather than gift. Tonight, Hermon matters, because Semyaza did not bow to the meaning of the place. He conscripted it. He treated sacred height as usable surface for shared trespass. And every later memory of Hermon now exposes that misreading again. Perhaps this is why the mountain also begins to feel silent in a different way. Earlier its silence warned. Then its silence witnessed. Now its silence remembers. It remembers not because the stone has consciousness like ours, but because memory has been tied to its contours in tradition and conscience. To speak of Hermon is to invoke the oath. To invoke the oath is to invoke the aftermath. The place has become narratively inseparable from the burden. That inseparability is the heart of this station. And maybe we can say more. Places remembered for grief often become narrower in imagination, as though all one sees there is the wound. Hermon must not become narrow. The mountain remains wide. Its range remains grand. Its ridgelines still move outward. Its snowfields still catch light. This wideness matters because regret is harder when the stage was spacious and warning rich. Semyaza did not sin in confinement. He sinned in a place full of room for reverence. The mountain gave scale enough for obedience. That is part of the accusation. A cramped soul may plead pressure. Hermon offered breadth, distance, clarity, height, and still he bound the company against order there. The return of sightline. One of the most haunting features of place memory is the way a remembered viewpoint comes back. To stand at Hermon is not only to stand somewhere, it is to see from somewhere, down toward valleys, out toward lands, up toward stars, back toward the ridge, inward toward the self. Sightline itself becomes part of memory. Tonight this matters because the mountain's regret is not flat. It is panoramic. The oath ignored what the height could see, and later memory cannot avoid what the height saw. That line matters. The oath ignored what the height could see. Roofs below, paths below, women below, sleeping children below, the waiting earth below. When Hermon returns in conscience, all of that returns with it. The mountain is accusatory not only because of what happened on it, but because of what could be seen from it while the oath was spoken. This is what makes the place morally immense. The whole visible field becomes part of the memory. No wonder regret deepens there. No wonder beauty hurts there. No wonder the mountain remains central long after the company has moved into the world. And still Hermon keeps its own dignity. That is an important guardrail. The mountain is not corrupted in itself. It is burdened in remembrance. God's creation does not become evil because creatures misuse it, but creation can become the site of intensified moral recall. Hermon, therefore, remains noble while being terrible to remember. The place is still God's mountain in the order of creation, even while it becomes humanity's and the Watcher's dark mnemonic in the order of story. That doubleness is painful and beautiful at once. It also prepares us for the next inward turn, because once a place becomes this burdened in memory, The question is no longer only what the mountain means. The question becomes what it does to the one whose leadership made the place unforgettable in the wrong way. Semyaza cannot think of Hermon as landscape only. He must think of it as authorship made visible. Every remembered ridge becomes a sentence about what he led. Every remembered win becomes aftermath. Every remembered height becomes exposure. There is another layer to place memory as well: repetition. Mountains are seen in more than one season, under more than one sky, from more than one road. A place tied to guilt does not accuse only once. Dawn touches it. Snow returns to it. Travelers point toward it. Children grow up hearing its name. And every fresh sight becomes another occasion for the old meaning to rise. Hermon in morning light would still be Hermon. Hermon beneath winter weather would still be Hermon. Hermon standing far off beyond ordinary labor would still be Hermon. That persistence is part of the pain. The mountain does not cooperate with forgetfulness. It keeps appearing in the world as itself, and therefore keeps appearing in conscience as the place where shared rebellion took form. In that sense, memory is renewed not only by thought, but by recurrence. A leader may wish for a wound to stay buried in 1 hour of the past. Place refuses that wish. Place stands there again, visible, stable, and ready to be remembered. And because mountains endure beyond one generation, Hermon also becomes teachable memory. Others can be told what happened there. The place carries story forward. It becomes a warning not only to the guilty, but to those who come later and learn that solemnity can be stolen without ever becoming safe. Each far glimpse repeats the charge. Sacred height remembers what fear formalized there. Dear seeker of wisdom, stay with the mountain one moment longer before we move into the leader's inner burden. See the ridge where solemnity was stolen. See the long shadow beneath. See the beauty that now accuses. See the place that cannot be revisited in imagination without reopening the story. This is Hermon as the mountain that remembers. And because it remembers, Semyaza will never again be able to call what happened there small. What kind of regret belongs to a leader who feared the burden, created the burden, and then watched it spread beyond him? Now the mountain turns inward, not away from place, through place. Hermon has already become burdened memory, and that means the title can no longer rest only in atmosphere or scenery. It must enter the conscience of the one whose name remains attached to the oath. This station is not an excuse for him. It is not a rehabilitation. It is not an invitation to admire wounded grandeur. It is a slow attempt to understand what regret feels like when the regret belongs to leadership rather than accident. That difference matters. There is regret for what one did alone. There is regret for what one persuaded others to do. There is regret for a moment. There is regret for an afterlife. Semyaza belongs to the latter sorrows. He knew enough to fear bearing the guilt alone. That was already clear at the oath. And because he knew enough to fear it, he knew enough to recognize the gravity of what he was proposing. This does not make him admirable. It makes him more responsible. One of the darkest features of his story is precisely that he sought shared guilt as a way of surviving anticipated consequence. He was not innocent when he organized solidarity. He was anxious before he was resolute. Anticipatory dread. Sin often contains fear before it contains fulfillment. Creatures sense, however dimly, that certain acts will not remain private or painless. That anticipatory dread can become a mercy if it leads to restraint. It becomes darker when it is used as fuel for collective resolve. Some souls do not overcome dread by turning back. They overcome dread by recruiting company. That sentence belongs to Semyaza. He feared the burden. so he distributed it. But distributed burden does not disappear. It returns in multiplied form. That is where regret begins to change shape for a leader. At first, he fears consequence as something that may land on him. Later, he discovers that consequence also radiates outward through the people he moved. This means the leader's sorrow is never only personal. It is refracted through others. He must see his own act repeated in their following, extended in their teaching, embodied in their influence, and mirrored in the world reshaped by their motion. No private conscience is light under that kind of history. Even if pride fights against confession, even if self-justification speaks loudly, even if rebellion learns to call itself necessity, somewhere under those defenses, the truth remains. He led. That simple fact is heavier than many speeches. He led the oath. He led the company. He led the descent. He led the release of a long shadow he could no longer control. And control matters here. Many leaders sin under the illusion that they can govern the consequences of what they unleash. Perhaps they imagine they can contain the damage, keep the circle small, manage the aftermath, or reclaim authority whenever needed. But leadership into ruin rarely behaves like a tool. Once the company is moving, once the gifts are spreading, once imitation begins, the leader no longer stands above the consequences as master. He is inside them. Sometimes he is among the most haunted by them because he recognizes their origin most clearly. Authorship without mastery. This phrase helps clarify the pain. Semyaza authored the common resolve, but he did not master what the resolve would become once it entered history. That is one reason regret deepens into something almost claustrophobic for leaders. They look upon a world partly shaped by their decision and realize that influence has exceeded intention. Personally, dear pilgrim, I think this is one of the most sobering truths in the whole story. There are acts we choose, and then there are consequences that begin choosing the world around us in return. Perhaps Semyaza first felt this not as moral clarity, but as pressure. Pressure when remembering Hermon. Pressure when hearing other names associated with forbidden instruction. Pressure when the consequences ceased being theoretical. Pressure when the lower world stopped being distant landscape and became visibly altered ground. The self does not easily welcome such knowledge. It resists. It reframes. It blames others. It emphasizes shared guilt. It remembers its own fear more tenderly than it remembers the vulnerability of those below. All of that may well belong to Semyaza's inward war. Regret is not always noble. Often it is mixed, defensive, partial, and bruised by self-protection. This station should preserve that complexity. We do not need to imagine him suddenly pure in sorrow, but neither should we flatten him into simple theatrical evil without inward consequence. The title asks for regret, and regret is more truthful when it appears as burdened consciousness rather than instant eloquence. The leader hearing his own name. One hidden agony of leadership is that names become symbols. A leader may once hear his own name simply as self-reference. Later, the name becomes attached to decisions, movements, followers, and consequences. Semyaza, in the tradition, is no longer merely a being among beings. It is a remembered leadership name. When a person's name becomes shorthand for a harmful turning, regret deepens because memory no longer leaves the self private. Imagine what that would mean, to hear your own name and not hear only yourself. To hear instead the oath, the ridge, the company, the descent, the valleys, the gifts, the corruption of ordinary life. That is the soundscape of his regret. Not one bad memory only, an entire chain of association. This is why I think the title's sorrow is less like a burst of remorse and more like a widening field of recognitions. A leader into ruin does not awaken one day with a single clear sentence and then feel sorrow cleanly. He carries an accumulating knowledge. Each new consequence interprets the old decision again. Each new distortion reveals what was already hidden in the oath. Each reminder enlarges the original guilt. Regret without repentance completed. We should be careful here. Regret is not the same as repentance. A creature can hate burden, foresee judgment, feel trapped by memory, and still refuse surrender to truth. The tradition's power lies partly in keeping that tension alive. Semyaza may be deeply burdened without becoming holy. He may feel the weight of authorship without yielding to restoration. Tonight that matters because it prevents sentimentalizing the title. Regret alone does not save a leader from what he led. And yet regret still matters. It matters because it names the fracture between what he wanted and what he came to know. Perhaps he wanted companionship. He found shared guilt. Perhaps he wanted desire fulfilled. He found history bent. Perhaps he wanted courage through solidarity. He found solidarity becoming accusation. Perhaps he wanted not to bear the burden alone. He found the burden multiplied through every follower and every after effect. That reversal is the emotional engine of this station. Many forms of evil promise relief before consequence. Then consequence becomes the only thing left. This is why leadership into ruin often produces a special kind of inward exhaustion. The leader must continue bearing the shape of command even after command has become miserable to remember. He cannot simply step outside the story he authored. The movement of others keeps returning him to himself. Their following becomes his mirror, and mirrors are hard here. We already saw how outward arts and surfaces were distorted under the forbidden gifts. Now the inward mirror becomes terrible. Not a polished object held in the hand, a memory held in conscience. In that mirror, Semyaza does not merely see a wrong desire. He sees a world he helped deform. Burdened leadership. Leadership magnifies moral reality because it turns inward resolve into shared pattern. The same will that would have remained private in one creature becomes historical when others receive it as direction. Tonight that matters, because Semyaza's regret is not merely greater in quantity than another creature's. It is different in kind. He is burdened not only by transgression, but by transmission. He handed something on. Personally, I think that is why the title stays with the listener. We know in our bones that being wrong alone is terrible, but making wrongness fertile in others is worse. If so, then perhaps the deepest pain of Semyaza's regret is not fear of punishment first, but recognition of reach. How far the oath reached. How far the dissent reached. How far the teaching reached. How far the distortion of desire reached. The farther it reached, the less escapable his authorship became, and still a strange irony remains. He sought company so that guilt would not crush him alone. But company is exactly what keeps the guilt alive before him. Had he stood alone in his transgression, the burden would have been dreadful. Because he led many, the burden returns through many. Every follower is remembrance. Every consequence is remembrance. Every altered custom below is remembrance. This is not repentance completed, but it is regret sharpened by leadership. There is also the question of sequence inside his regret. Which realization hurts first? Does he first grieve that he feared the burden and still went forward? Does he first grieve that others trusted his seriousness enough to follow? Does he first grieve that the lower world received effects it never chose? Perhaps leadership regret moves through all those chambers in uneven order. Some nights, the mind returns to the ledge. Some nights to the faces or names of those who agreed. Some nights to the thought of households below, some nights to the spreading of the gifts into ordinary custom. Guilt is rarely tidy when it belongs to influence. It migrates, it circles, it finds new entrances into the self, and there is humiliation in that circling. A leader usually wishes to appear coherent, commanding, and justified even to himself. Regret breaks that posture from within. It reminds him that command did not equal wisdom, that initiative did not equal righteousness, and that having followers did not mean deserving them. The very capacities that once felt like strength begin to appear as liabilities under truth. Persuasion becomes evidence. Resolve becomes evidence. Strategic speech becomes evidence. The ability to gather others becomes evidence. Everything that once seemed useful in the moment now testifies against the one who used it badly. Perhaps this is why burdened leaders often become restless interpreters of their own past. They revise it, soften it, complicate it, or distribute its blame more widely than honesty allows. Yet none of those maneuvers can fully quiet the central fact. He led. That short sentence survives every evasion. And because it survives, regret keeps finding him where excuses end. Even memory itself refuses obedience to his excuses. It keeps arranging the evidence in order. Fear, oath, followers, dissent, shadow, witness, sentence. He can share a rebellion, but he cannot share away authorship. The moment memory sorts the story honestly, his leadership rises to the surface and names him first. There is another humiliation too. He cannot return to being merely one among many. Even if all shared the vow, he remains the one who gave the fear a mouth. That asymmetry does not fade. The circle may be collective, but the authorship is not evenly distributed. And because it is not evenly distributed, regret keeps settling back upon him with special weight. A leader may try to disappear into the group he created, yet the group itself points back to him. It exists in the shape he supplied. This is why inward weariness belongs to the station. Not sleepy weariness yet, but the fatigue of carrying a history that keeps proving your first decision larger than you wanted it to be. Dear, gentle soul, hold the title with exactness here. Not Semyaza's brilliance, not Semyaza's grandeur, not even, first of all, Semyaza's rebellion. Semyaza's regret, the regret of the one who feared the burden, created the burden, shared the burden, and then discovered that multiplied burden does not become lighter, only more historical. The next station introduces another figure whose presence makes this sorrow more explicit. For when prophetic witness enters the story, inward burden can no longer remain only private weather. It is named, addressed, and brought under a word from outside the guilty self. Section 11. Enoch at the edge of the ruin. What changes when the burden surrounding the watchers is met by a witness who speaks from outside their self-justifying circle? There comes a point in stories of ruin when consequence is no longer enough. There must also be witness, not because God needs more information, because guilty beings do. That is why Enoch belongs here, not as decorative piety, not as a sudden shift into unrelated material, but as the necessary entrance of a voice not generated by the oath, the company, or the corrupted curriculum beneath Hermon. Everything so far has unfolded under the logic of the Watcher's own decision, and it spread through place, descent, gift, and memory. But no guilty circle can interpret itself truly forever. Sooner or later, another voice stands at the edge of its story. Enoch as witness. The old traditions remember Enoch as scribe, seer, walker with God, and recipient of heavenly disclosure. He is not powerful in the same way the Watchers appear powerful. His force lies in reception, testimony, and fidelity to what is shown rather than seized. When rebellion becomes fluent, one of mercy's severest gifts is a witness who does not speak from inside its language. That sentence explains why his arrival matters. The Watchers know desire. They know oath. They know dissent. They know influence. They know shadow. But Enoch knows how to hear before God. That difference is immense. In some sense, he stands where the Watchers should have stood, under revelation rather than overcreation, receiving meaning rather than forcing it, walking within order rather than reorganizing order around appetite. That is why his presence is not merely informative, it is contrast made human. And contrast is powerful. Against Hermon's misused height, Enoch represents true height received. Against corrupted instruction, he represents transmitted truth. Against self-authorizing oath, he represents commissioned witness. Against leadership into ruin, he represents speech under God. No wonder the story sharpens when he appears. Outside word. A guilty company can survive internal echo for a surprisingly long time. Members reinforce one another, explain one another, and normalize what once felt unbearable. But an outside word breaks the spell, because it is not nourished by the same fear or desire. Tonight, Enoch matters, because he carries that kind of outside word. Personally, dear pilgrim, I think one of the most frightening things for any rebellion is not punishment first, but truthful address. Truthful address can feel more terrible than pain at first, because it leaves less room for fantasy. Perhaps that is why Enoch's role should be handled with calm severity rather than spectacle. He does not need thunder to matter. He matters because he speaks into a field of guilt that can no longer pretend it is merely complicated. He names, he interprets, he locates the Watchers beneath judgment rather than above the story. And that is precisely what Semyaza's regret has been approaching. So far, the leader's burden has been atmospheric, historical, and inward. With witness, it becomes articulated. The guilty self may already feel weight. But when a faithful witness enters, the weight receives language. What had been pressure becomes accusation named. What had been unrest becomes meaning. What had been dim fear begins to hear the structure of judgment, petition, and refusal. In the broader Watcher's tradition, the fallen ones seek mediation, hoping Enoch will carry their plea. This detail matters because it reveals a stunning asymmetry. The ones who taught corrupted arts now need a righteous scribe to voice what they cannot secure for themselves. The very existence of such a plea exposes how deeply they know their estrangement. Rebellion often discovers too late that it still longs for the kind of nearness it despised while choosing distance. That longing belongs here. Not a holy longing yet. Not surrender yet. But the desperate recognition that self-authored power cannot heal self-authored guilt. Evil can organize a company. It cannot finally absolve one. Evil can teach arts. It cannot restore order. Evil can multiply influence. It cannot turn judgment into peace. This is where Enoch's presence becomes almost unbearable for Semyaza. The leader who supplied the common mouth now confronts a messenger whose mouth is not his to command. The one who turned solemnity toward trespass must hear solemnity returned toward judgment. The one who led others into a binding vow must face a word that binds him to consequence rather than escape. Prophetic contrast to the oath. The oath on Hermon was self-sealed speech. Prophetic witness is commissioned speech. The difference is everything. One arises from fear, desire, and collective resolve against order. The other arises from reception under divine order. Tonight, that contrast helps us understand why Enoch's presence changes the atmosphere of the whole story. He is not merely another character. He is another kind of speaking. Imagine the relief. guilty beings often seek in intermediaries. If only someone else could frame our sorrow. If only someone else could carry our appeal. If only someone still near to God could stand where we no longer can. That wish reveals a great deal. It reveals distance felt. It reveals helplessness admitted. It reveals that power has failed to secure peace. And perhaps it reveals the deepest ache in Semyaza's regret. He led others away from obedience, but he cannot lead them back by the same power that led them down. That is devastating. Leadership into ruin often contains an unspoken fantasy that the leader can repair by stronger direction what he harmed by earlier direction. But there are thresholds after which command cannot heal what command distorted. Mediation, mercy, and judgment now belong to another order entirely. That is where Enoch stands. He belongs to the order Semyaza cannot manufacture. Enoch in the mountain remembered. Though Enoch is not reducible to Hermon, his presence throws Hermon back into sharper relief. The mountain where solemnity was stolen is now remembered in the light of a witness whose speech is rightly ordered. This means the place itself feels even more divided in significance. On one side, misused height. On the other, true reception of height from God. Personally, I think this is one reason the station feels so grave. Enoch does not erase Hermon's sorrow. He interprets it. Interpretation is heavy. Some burdens are hard enough when they remain felt. They become harder when they are explained truly. That is what witness does. It removes excuses. It gives the conscience no fog in which to hide. And still the station should remain quiet. We are not staging a courtroom thunderclap. We are letting the air tighten around a word from outside guilt. Enoch's faithfulness is severe, exactly because it is steady. He does not need the charisma of ruin. He does not need the drama of heights misused. He stands in another gravity. That makes him the perfect counterweight to the Watcher's self-generated solemnity. Semyaza must feel this contrast-like exposure. The leader of the oath meets the servant of the word. The one who organized rebellion meets the one who transmits judgment. The one who made company around fear meets the one who stands under God without needing fear to authorize his speech. That meeting reveals what sort of authority each really bears, and it is not the same. There is a tenderness and a severity in Enoch together that the Watcher's world cannot generate for itself. Tenderness, because true witness still stands near enough to speak. Severity, because true witness will not lie in order to make guilty beings feel less judged. That balance matters. If Enoch were only harsh, the station would become thin. If he were only gentle, the truth would lose weight. But sacred witness often holds both. It names ruin without being fascinated by it. It carries a message without borrowing the glamour of the powerful. It remains human in scale while speaking words larger than any mountain oath. This is one reason the Watcher's appeal to Enoch feels so revealing. They do not ask another rebel to plead for them. They do not ask one of their own circle to invent a softer account. They seek the man whose life is marked by nearness of another kind. In doing so, they confess something by implication. They know the difference between stolen solemnity and received authority. They know the difference between power that takes and witness that answers. They know, however unwillingly, that the architecture of rebellion cannot generate its own absolution. And perhaps Enoch's writing matters as much as his speaking. A spoken word enters the air and the memory. A written word also remains. It can be returned to. It can stand when feeling shifts. It can outlast the guilty mood of a moment. The Watchers had already made Hermon a place that remembers. Through witness, the story itself becomes a record that remembers. That too intensifies Semyaza's burden. The one who turned vow into history must now face history rendered in words not under his command. There is something profoundly humbling about that. Rebellion often wants the final narration of itself. It wants to decide what its actions meant. It wants to keep authorship not only over the deed but over the interpretation. Enoch shatters that illusion. The deed will be named by truth, not by the self that committed it. The future meaning of Hermon will not be dictated by the oath. It will be interpreted under God. For the listener, this is strangely stabilizing. It means the story does not remain trapped inside the intensity of the watcher's own perspective. Another frame has entered. Another order of speech has entered. The ruin is still real, but it is no longer the largest thing in the narrative field. Truth is larger. Witness is steadier, and that steadiness, even before the sleep sections fully arrive, begins to calm the imagination. The mountain is not abandoned to the guilty. The story is not abandoned to the guilty either. Yet Enoch's steadiness is not cold. Because he belongs to truthful nearness, he can stand near corruption without borrowing its fever. That, too, is part of witness. It does not panic before the guilty, and it does not flatter them. It stands, listens, receives, speaks, and leaves the burden exactly where truth says it belongs. That is why Enoch's presence feels almost like clear air entering a sealed chamber. He does not create guilt. He makes its atmosphere breathable enough to be known. And in that knowing, the watchers lose the last comfort of self-description. They may still resist, but they can no longer pretend their story is finally theirs to narrate. A faithful witness has entered it, and faithfulness always changes the scale of every ruin it names before God and before their own memory. We may also notice that Enoch does not need to become mountain-like in order to answer Hermon. He does not compete in scale. He does not try to impress the heights. In sacred storytelling, that is often how truth arrives, not by matching corrupted grandeur with greater theatrics, but by bringing clean speech into a defiled atmosphere. This should steady the listener. It means righteousness is not weaker because it is quieter. And perhaps the watcher's dependence on Enoch for mediation reveals the final poverty of self-authorized power. They could descend, teach, bind, and spread corruption, yet they could not secure a word of peace from heaven. For that, they needed the very kind of obedient nearness they had abandoned. The contrast could hardly be sharper. So Enoch stands in the story not only as messenger, but as measure. By him, we learn how distorted the Watchers have become. By him, Semyaza's regret becomes more exact, because the leader is forced to see what true authority looks like beside his own broken version. Dear faithful seeker, hold the scene in its quiet severity. The mountain remembered, the shadows spread, the leader burdened, and now Enoch at the edge of the ruin, not dazzled by power, not seduced by scale, not recruited into the guilty circle, but speaking from beyond it. The next station will take us farther into the irreversible shape of judgment. For once witness has spoken, the story can no longer pretend it is only about atmosphere, burden, or memory. The oath that changed the mountain must now be seen as an oath whose consequences will not simply be wished away. What happens when the vow that once bound the Watchers together is revealed, under judgment, as something they cannot undo by desire or appeal? At the beginning, the oath felt like power. That is one of the oldest lies in rebellious speech. To bind oneself against order can feel strong in the moment, because it gives fear a structure, desire a chorus, and uncertainty a common direction. It feels decisive. It feels iron. It feels as though creatures have made themselves less fragile by refusing to stand alone. But under judgment, the same oath changes appearance. It no longer looks like power. It looks like a sentence already seated inside the act. This is the severe truth of the station. Nothing new is added to the moral nature of the vow. when judgment is announced. Judgment reveals what the vow already was. What felt like solidarity now appears as shared entrapment. What felt like courage now appears as organized defiance. What felt like mutual strengthening now appears as a collective narrowing into consequence. Self-binding revealed. A wrongful oath binds not only companions to each other, but companions to the future they have chosen against warning. In that sense, judgment is not arbitrary interruption. It is the unveiling of the oath's true direction. Many sins are already sentences in seed form. Divine judgment does not invent their gravity so much as disclose it. That line belongs here because it clarifies the movement from Hermon's ledge to the prophetic word. The sentence was hidden inside the vow from the beginning. Not fully visible, not yet fully historical, but present as trajectory. Once Enoch's witness enters, trajectory becomes declaration. The guilty can no longer confuse being bound together with being safe together. Perhaps this is the deepest disillusionment for Semyaza. He wanted company. He gained a company under sentence. He wanted the burden shared. He created a burden formally distributed and formally inescapable. He wanted the future narrowed so retreat would become costly. Under judgment, he discovers that the future has indeed narrowed, but not into triumph, into consequence. That is the bitter fulfillment of his own method, the irreversible turn. We must use this idea carefully. Only God is absolute Lord over endings, and mercy remains God's prerogative in ways no creature can dictate. But in the moral texture of this story, there is an irreversible turn once the oath, dissent, corruption, and witness converge. The watchers cannot simply walk backward into pre-oath innocence. They cannot unsay the vow, unteach the arts, or unshadow the valleys by wishing it so. Personally, dear pilgrim, I think this is one reason the title presses so hard on the conscience. Regret feels sharpest where reversal is least available. And perhaps that is why judgment often sounds like truth more than surprise. Guilty beings may dread it. They may resist it. They may plead against it. But somewhere deep beneath defense, they recognize it. The oath already taught them this. They made retreat difficult on purpose. Now judgment names what their own structure prepared. This is not a different story imposed from outside. It is the story made plain. The plea that cannot heal the vow. Tradition remembers the watchers desiring intercession, hoping for a message that might soften what they had set in motion. That desire is understandable, but it cannot reach backward far enough to heal the nature of the act itself. A plea can reveal need. It cannot convert rebellion into obedience retroactively. Tonight that matters, because the sentence is not merely emotional consequence. It is moral consequence, attached to a real history. Sorrow may become honest. Too late to become reversal. This does not make the station cruel. It makes it exact. Exactness is one of the forms of sacred severity. The world below has already been touched. The lower order has already been deformed. Ordinary life has already received shadow. The heights have already been misused. If the oath could now be treated as an impulsive mistake easily dissolved, the whole story would lie about the seriousness of leadership, teaching, and place. So the station holds steady. The vow becomes visible as sentence. The mountain that once carried shared speech now carries declared consequence in memory as well. Hermon grows heavier again, not because the mountain changes nature, because memory receives a final hard edge. The place of oath becomes the place of no easy return, and that phrase matters, no easy return. The story is not teaching that guilt was light until a heavenly word made it heavy. It is teaching that guilt was already heavy, and the heavenly word took away the guilty illusion that heaviness could be mastered by more strategy. The watchers cannot out-organize judgment. They cannot out-teach it, outnumber it, or outclimb it. Once God's truth addresses the story, Creaturely arrangements stop pretending to be ultimate. Sentence is unveiling. The best way to feel the station may be this. The sentence does not fall onto an empty scene. It unveils the scene. It lets us see what the oath truly became. It reveals that collective resolve against obedience is not a fortress, but a chamber with the door closing. Personally, I think many listeners know this pattern in lesser human forms. We cling to what once made us feel strong, only to discover that it was already becoming our confinement. Semyaza's regret must therefore sharpen into a new kind of knowledge here. Earlier, he felt burden. Then he felt authorship. Then witness arrived. Now the structure closes. The leader sees that what he formed will not simply loosen because he now hates its weight. There is deep tragedy in that. Not tragedy in the sense of moral ambiguity. The wrong is still wrong. But tragedy in the sense that the very instrument chosen for courage has become the instrument of inescapable consequence. The oath was supposed to prevent solitary burden. Instead, it created collective sentence. What a bitter inversion. And yet perhaps this station offers a strange clarity that the earlier ones could not. Once the sentence is visible, the false glamour drains further from the story. We are no longer dealing with high beings making dramatic moves across sacred geography. We are dealing with creatures under truth. The oath loses its aura. The descent loses its thrill. The gifts lose their fascination. All of them now stand within the same revealed frame. Rebellion that borrowed solemnity and became historical ruin. This is a mercy to the listener. It protects the imagination from envy. It keeps the title morally clear. Semyaza is not tragic, because defiance is magnificent. He is tragic because he led magnificence astray and learned too late that magnitude does not rescue guilt. We may say even more. A sentence revealed in this way does not merely close a door, it clarifies the whole path behind the door. Suddenly, the ledge, the silence, the descent, the valleys, the gifts, and the witness all gather into one moral line. What had seemed like separate dramatic stations now shows itself as one continuous rebellion. That continuity is painful because it removes the fantasy that there were many harmless moments strung together by accident. No, there was an inner logic. The oath belonged to the descent. The descent belonged to the shadow. The shadow belonged to the corruption of life below, and the witness belonged to the naming of the whole. That means Semyaza cannot even comfort himself with fragmentation. He cannot say, perhaps the oath was serious, but the teaching was someone else's matter. He cannot say, perhaps the gift spread, but the mountain was only scenery. He cannot say, perhaps judgment arrived, but it was disconnected from the first fear that drove him to seek shared guilt. Sentence gathers all those evasions into one answer. The story is connected. Leadership connected it. The vow connected it. History confirmed it. This is why the station feels so narrow in a holy way. False options fall away. False romance falls away. False complexity invented only to blur obedience, falls away. Under judgment, the world becomes simpler, though not easier. The oath was wrong. The influence was ruinous. The appeal for softer terms cannot undo the nature of what was chosen. Some clarity comes too late to prevent suffering, but it is still clarity. And perhaps this is where the listener should feel the difference between sacred severity and cruelty. Cruelty enjoys humiliation. Sacred severity tells the truth in proportion to reality. Cruelty would make the watcher's terror into spectacle. Sacred severity makes their terror into revelation. It shows what a creature becomes when solemnity is stolen, shared, and extended into the lives of others. It does not delight in the fall. It refuses to lie about it. That refusal is part of the dignity of the whole story. Because the story tells the truth, the mountain remains morally intelligible. Because the story tells the truth, the title does not collapse into tragic glamour. Because the story tells the truth, regret becomes more than mood. It becomes the painful knowledge of a structure that cannot now be treated as unreal. Once judgment speaks, pretense becomes the heaviest thing in the scene. Better the severe word than the soft lie. And so the oath becomes sentence, not by changing its essence, but by losing its disguise. The iron the Watchers thought they forged for courage becomes the iron of their confinement. The solidarity they trusted becomes proof that many can walk together into one doom. The solemnity they borrowed becomes evidence against them. Their own method rises up as witness. There are few reversals more bitter than that. A sentence like this also reveals the poverty of rebellion's imagination. The Watchers thought chiefly about crossing the threshold, securing one another, and taking what desire wanted. They did not truly imagine the full moral world that would stand against them afterward. Judgment restores that world in a single frame. Suddenly, obedience, creaturely limit, vulnerable lives below, violated place, corrupted teaching, and divine truth all surround the oath at once. There is no room left for the fantasy that the act was bold simply because it was difficult. Difficulty is not glory. Risk is not righteousness. Shared determination is not innocence. The sentence strips away those confusions and leaves the vow facing everything it tried to ignore. That is why the station feels so final without becoming loud. Finality here is not noise. It is the still, terrible recognition that the oath has reached the end of all its disguises. Nothing remains now but truth, memory, and the consequences that truth refuses to rename. And what truth names fully, no frightened company can afterwards call small. And disguise cannot survive a spoken verdict now. Another way to say it is this. The oath once promised companionship against fear, but sentence reveals that companionship without truth only deepens fear in the end. No one in the company can become refuge for the others when all are bound in the same rebellion. Shared guilt may delay loneliness for a moment. It cannot create peace. Under judgment, that fact becomes painfully plain. And so the structure Semyaza trusted fails at its deepest point. It can sustain motion. It cannot sustain meaning. It can keep others beside him. It cannot keep the future open. It can multiply participation. It cannot convert participation into innocence. There is still one more bitterness in it. The Watchers use solemn speech to make rebellion feel durable. Under judgment, that same durability becomes their terror. What they wanted to stabilize has stabilized against them. The oath holds, but it holds as exposure, not as shelter. It holds as remembered guilt, not as refuge. In that reversal, the whole tragedy hardens into shape. Dear spiritual traveler, receive the station in its severe quiet. The ledge is still there in memory. The company is still there in memory. The valleys are still there in memory. The witness has spoken, and now the oath stands revealed as sentence. The next movement cannot remain at this pitch forever. Night Watch storytelling must know how to lower the body without denying the truth it has carried. So the next section will begin that lowering. We will not leave Hermon, but we will stand beneath its stars in a different tempo, letting the burden settle into a quieter watch as the story starts turning toward rest. How does a mountain story of ruin begin lowering into rest without pretending the ruin was small? Now the tempo must change, not by denying what has been said, by learning how to keep watch without straining. This is the first true lowering section of the script. The burden remains, Hermon remains, the oath, the descent, the shadow, the witness, and the sentence all remain in the structure behind us. But the body listening at night cannot remain at the pitch of declared consequence forever. Night Watch is not forgetfulness. It is the art of letting truth stand while the breathing grows slower around it. So return to the mountain once more. Not to the ledge exactly. Not to the company. Not to the first moment of speech. Return to Hermon under the cold stars after the story has already shown its shape. The air is thin. The dark is wide. The ridgelines are quieter now in the imagination. Nothing has been repaired by our slowing, and yet the slowing matters. A mountain at night does not demand hurried thought. It receives watch. It receives breath. It receives the small humility of a creature no longer trying to control the scale of things. That humility is part of the healing of the listener, even while the story itself remains unhealed. If earlier sections asked us to feel authorship, accusation, and sentence, this one asks us to stand under them without tightening every muscle. There is a difference between vigilance and strain. Vigilance is awake. Strain is self-consuming. Night Watch storytelling gradually releases the second while keeping enough of the first to preserve reverence. So let Hermon stand before you, in fewer words now. Cold stone, a long dark slope. Stars not hurried by human sorrow. Wind moving over places that remember more than they can say. The mountain remains what it was in creation. Its burden lies in memory, and memory can be held more gently than before. Not falsely, gently. Perhaps that is one of the hidden mercies of night. Night does not excuse the day's wrongs, but it does lower the noise around them. It lets outlines replace detail. It lets the body stop grasping for mastery. It teaches creatures again that they are small beneath a larger order. That lesson belongs beautifully on Hermon. The mountain that witnessed stolen solemnity now also teaches the listener creaturely scale. Its height still corrects hurry. Its distance still thins vanity. Its silence still presses against the restless wish to organize the world around one's own fear. That is why this station can begin easing the script towards sleep without abandoning its subject. Hermon itself helps. A sacred height in darkness has a way of gathering the mind away from clutter and into a narrower, quieter field. The story remains grave, but the atmosphere grows less crowded. We no longer need every argument. We no longer need every consequence named again. We need the watch, a steady watch, a patient watch, a watch that says, "The mountain remembers, and you do not have to force the remembering tonight." A watch that says, "Judgment is real, and you do not have to keep your chest braced as though bracing could change it." A watch that says, "There is a difference between reverence and panic." Maybe imagine the stars above Hermon as older than the oath in our telling, older than the descent, older than the spread of gifts, older than the fear of the guilty. They are not indifferent, but they are steady. That steadiness can be borrowed by the listener, even when the story itself is not peaceful. Some nights rest comes not from cheerful material, but from standing beside something larger and more settled than one's own inner noise. A cold mountain can do that. A high sky can do that. A slow voice can do that. And perhaps the wind matters most here. Not a storm wind, not a dramatic wind. A thin night wind crossing stone. The kind of wind that does not explain anything. It only moves. It passes over ridges, over old memory, over places where words once changed history. And it does not carry the urgency those words carried. It reminds the body that not every movement in the world is pressure. Some movement is simply passing air. Some sound is simply distance touching stone. This is good for the script now. We have carried enough weight to earn quietness. Not lightness yet. Quietness. Let the mountain be mostly shape. Let the sky be mostly depth. Let the story be mostly behind the eyes now. Not pressing so hard at the forehead. The listener need not solve Semyaza tonight. need not rescue him, need not argue with the sentence, need only keep a little watch beneath Hermon's cold stars and feel how small human striving becomes when placed beneath a vast and remembering night. The oath happened. The shadow spread. The witness came. The sentence stood. And still, the mountain remains under the sky. That remaining is strangely calming. It means the world is larger than the rebellion that scarred it, larger than the name that led it, larger than the fear that organized it, larger than the curriculum that followed it. Creation still exceeds corruption. That is not the same as saying corruption is trivial. It is saying it is not ultimate. For a tired listener, that distinction can become a place to rest, not a triumphant rest, a lower, quieter one. The kind that begins when the hands stop trying to hold the whole story at once. So stay here a little while. Hermon in outline. Stars above, wind along stone. Dark valleys below, mostly hidden now. A burdened history no longer needing to be shouted. A watch kept gently. If your breathing has begun to slow, let it slow. If the shoulders have dropped a little, let them drop. If the mind is still following the ridgeline, let it follow more softly. A good watch also knows what to leave unnamed for a little while. We have named much tonight. Enough, perhaps, for the mind to respect the mountain and then stop pressing its face against every sharp edge. Rest often begins when the soul accepts that truth has been sufficiently spoken for now. No more forcing, no more collecting, no more trying to improve the night by one additional insight. Hermon can stand in outline and still teach. Notice how little is needed at this hour. A ridgeline, a sky, a breath entering and leaving. The sense of cool distance where, earlier, there had been strain. If thoughts return to Semyaza, let them return slowly and without argument. He is part of the story, but he does not have to occupy the whole inner room. If thoughts return to Enoch or to judgment, let them arrive as quiet shapes rather than as urgent voices. The mountain story is still there, but the listener may now stand a few steps back from it. That stepping back is not indifference, it is proportion. Even grief must sometimes be viewed from a little farther away if the body is to soften into rest. The stars help with that. So does the dark, which hides detail without hiding form. So does the cold, which simplifies sensation. So does the patient idea that you are not being asked to carry the whole burden of the world tonight. You are only being asked to keep a small, reverent watch until watch itself begins dissolving into sleep. Perhaps this is why mountain stories have long helped tired minds. Height simplifies. It removes the clutter of the near field and offers a larger outline in which smaller agitations begin to lose their sharpness. Hermon, even burdened by memory, still offers that simplification tonight. One ridge after another, one band of dark above another, one patient sky holding all the unanswerable things without haste. There is no need to force a lesson beyond that. Let the mountain remain larger than the analysis now. Let the stars remain higher than the argument. Let the wind be only wind for a little while. The script has already carried its meanings far enough for this hour. The rest can wait in the dark without being solved. If sleep is near, do not resist it by trying to hold the whole story awake. The story will still be there. Hermon will still be there in memory. But your body may rest beneath a sky that does not require constant explanation. It is enough, for now, to have kept watch and then to let the watch grow thin, like breath in cold air, until even the mountain begins to feel more distant and more gentle in the mind. There is still one more mercy in the night watch. Because darkness softens edges, it teaches the mind to live with outline where daylight demanded detail. You do not need every contour of Hermon now. You need only enough shape to feel the height. enough sky to feel the steadiness, enough distance to let your thoughts stop crowding one another. Even solemn stories can become bearable when they are held at the scale of stars. Night can hold that confession more softly. The same mountain that, in judgment, exposed everything now becomes a place where exposure no longer needs to be stared at. It can remain true at the edge of awareness while the body settles. This is not forgetting. It is trust that the truth does not disappear when your grip loosens. So let the ridgeline stay where it is. Let the cold stars stay where they are. Let the watch become simpler than thought, breath, distance, dark. A story carried far enough for one night. The mountain remains, and you may rest beneath its remembered height without carrying all its burden consciously any longer. Let the ridgeline recede without resistance. When the watch grows quiet enough, even the mountain seems to breathe more slowly in the mind. That is a good place to stop reaching. Let the height remain high. Let the dark remain wide. Let the story rest at a distance, where it can be honored, received, and gently set down tonight for rest. For now, we have done enough. We have climbed, listened, descended, widened the frame, traced the shadow, returned to memory, entered regret, heard witness, and felt the sentence. At this station beneath the cold stars, all that remains is to keep watch without hurry, and allow the mountain's dark steadiness to begin carrying the weight more quietly than before. How does a burdened mountain become distant enough for the listener to rest without the truth being denied? Now even Hermon may begin to grow distant, not absent, not unreal, distant. That distinction matters in the final movement of the script. We are not being asked to forget the oath, the dissent, the shadow, the witness, or the sentence. We are being asked to let them stand where they belong, while the listening body no longer keeps them pressed close. The mountain can remain true without remaining immediate. Night often offers that mercy. It does not erase the contours of a thing. It softens their pressure by giving them depth, distance, and quiet edges. So imagine Hermon no longer as the exact ledge where speech was stolen, no longer as the precise slope of descent, no longer even as the burdened sight of memory stared at too directly. Imagine it now as a dark height farther off, a shape in the distance, a cool presence under stars, still severe, still real, but gentler to behold, because it is no longer filling the whole inward field. This is one of night's kindest transformations. What in daylight demanded attention can, by darkness, become outline. What by nearness felt almost unmanageable can, by distance, become something the soul can live beside. The truth has not weakened. The truth has simply ceased shouting at the senses. That is what the script needs now. The listener does not have to revisit every station again. Not the oath, not the long shadow, not the heavy logic of leadership and judgment. All of that has already been carried far enough for one night. Now the mountain may remain as one dark line beneath a patient sky. And perhaps that is enough. Perhaps enough, at this hour, is holier than more. A ridgeline fading, cold air imagined from afar. The sense that something high and solemn still stands where it stood before, though you no longer need to climb it in thought. That is the beginning of rest, not victory, not resolution. Rest. Rest often begins when the mind stops returning to the sharpest points in order to prove that it still cares. Care can remain after intensity has lowered. Reverence can remain after analysis has eased. A grave story can remain true even when the body is no longer braced against it. Hermon growing distant teaches exactly that. The mountain is still there, but your breathing no longer has to ascend with it. If your thoughts drift back towards Semyaza, let them drift gently. He remains what he was in the story, the leader who feared the burden, the leader who multiplied it, the leader whose regret could not undo what leadership released. You do not need to sharpen that sentence again tonight. You may let it lie farther away, beneath the same sky that now holds the mountain. If your thoughts drift toward Enoch, let them drift gently there as well. The witness has already spoken. Truth has already entered the story. Nothing more needs to be argued in the dark. The faithful word stands, whether or not the weary mind keeps repeating it. That, too, is a mercy. Some truths are trustworthy enough to remain standing when we stop guarding them. Maybe think now not of the exact details, but of the simple arrangement of the world in this final watch. The mountain far off, the sky above it, the valleys mostly hidden, the wind reduced to an idea of passing coolness. The stars no longer judicial in the old sharp sense, only steady. Such steadiness helps tired minds. It tells them they are not required to hold every contour in order for the contour to remain. It tells them that reality does not collapse when attention loosens. It tells them that one can honor a burden without carrying it at full weight through every hour of the night. This is important because many listeners do not know how to stop thinking without feeling they have become careless. But gentle distance is not carelessness. It is proportion. It is the return of scale. Hermon is large. You are not required to make yourself equal to it. The story is grave. You are not required to keep your whole body tightened around its gravity. Distance allows the truth to stand in its own size, while the listener returns to creaturely size. And creaturely size is restful. A small breath, a quiet pillow, a room dimmer than the mountain, a body no longer climbing any ridge, just listening, just resting beneath the thought of a far, cold height that has already taught what it needed to teach. Perhaps this is why mountains so often become companions to sleep once their first severity has passed. They gather thought upward and away from the cramped details of the near field. They simplify, they widen. They give the mind one dark, coherent form to rest beside instead of 100 flickering concerns. Hermon can do that now, even burdened by memory. It can stand at a distance where its meaning is not erased, only gentled by scale. Let it be mostly shape now, mostly distance, mostly cool dark under patient stars. If some part of the story still feels sharp, do not wrestle it. Sharpness softens more easily when not gripped. Let the edges blur a little. Let the ridgeline lose detail. Let the valleys disappear almost entirely into shadow. Let the name Hermon become less a place you are analyzing and more a distant. This is how night lowers the mind kindly. Not by force, by widening the dark around what once felt too near. Soon the mountain may seem less like a burden scene and more like a far silhouette kept within God's larger world. That is a healing shift for the listener. The mountain does not become harmless, but it does become held. Its remembered sorrow no longer dominates the whole horizon. It belongs within a creation larger than the wrong done upon it. And you, listening, belong within that larger creation too. Not inside the oath, not inside the sentence, not inside the old fear that organized rebellion. You belong beneath a sky that remains above mountains and men, above leaders and witnesses, above sorrow and memory. That sky is wide enough for sleep, so let the breathing lengthen if it wishes. Let the jaw unclench if it wishes. Let the shoulders release their small, hidden labors. Let the mountain remain far enough away that you do not need to climb into its cold. Only see it there, dark, distant, still, and because it is distant, gentler. This is the hour when meaning begins to settle like fine dust rather than striking like stone. The story will remain by morning. Hermon will remain in memory. Nothing true is being lost. The night is simply placing the mountain where the tired mind can bear it without strain. There is also kindness in letting distance do its work slowly. A mountain does not have to vanish before it stops troubling the body. It only has to move far enough into the background that the pulse no longer rises to meet it. So if Hermon is still present in the imagination, let it be present the way far weather is present, or the way a remembered bell is present after the ringing has already faded. You know it was there. You know it still belongs to the night. But you are no longer inside the first vibration of it. This is how rest often arrives after solemn material, not in one clean change, but in a gradual mercy, by which what was once vivid becomes bearable, and what was once bearable becomes almost gentle. The mountain can keep its truth while losing its urgency. The story can keep its meaning while losing its sharpest edge against your breathing. Even sorrow, held at a faithful distance, can become quiet enough to sleep beside. And perhaps this is where the listener may remember something simpler than all the structures we have traced. Heights are not ours to master. We look at them, we learn from them, we receive proportion from them, but we do not carry them home on our backs. Hermon does not need to be carried into sleep like a burden tied to the chest. It may remain where it belongs, outside you, beneath the sky, inside God's world. That is one of the final freedoms of the section. The mountain is real, and because it is real, you can stop trying to hold it together in thought. Reality holds without your help. Distance also changes the way the imagination carries sound. Earlier in the story, every word seemed close to the ear. The oath, the witness, the sentence, the heavy naming of what went wrong. But in the final descent, language itself begins to thin. What remains is not argument, but cadence. Not insistence, but hush. Hermon becoming distant means the whole tale is becoming less like a demand and more like a low outline remembered in peace. This is why the last movement does not need many hard edges. It needs softness faithful enough to keep the shape while releasing the strain. A mountain in the distance does not stop being a mountain because detail is lost. Often it becomes more restful, precisely because the eye receives form without being asked to account for every stone. So let the same be true of the story now. Let meaning remain in outline. Let sorrow remain in outline. Let truth remain in outline. And let outline be enough for sleep. And if one last thought rises, let it be peaceful. The night is large enough to carry memory and mercy together. You need not choose between truth and rest. Under God's keeping, even solemn things can grow quiet enough for sleep. That is enough now. A far ridgeline, a great dark, a patient sky, and a listener whose work of attention is almost done. How does the story end in rest, when the mountain, the regret, and the truth all remain? Now let the night hold the mountain. You do not have to hold it alone. That may be the gentlest final answer the script can offer. From the beginning, this story has carried height, oath, burden, descent, shadow, witness, and consequence. It has asked the listener to stand on cold ground, to see far, to feel the wrongness of misused solemnity, and to follow the afterlife of one leader's fear into a wider history of ruin. But no soul can sleep while still clutching every contour of such a story. So the ending does not erase the mountain. It entrusts the mountain to the night. Let Hermon remain where it is. Far off now, no longer demanding your effort, no longer pressing every detail forward, only standing. Dark and quiet. Inside, a world watched over by God, better than any creature watches over anything. That sentence matters most in the end. Watched over by God. Because the final rest of the listener cannot depend on Semyaza, cannot depend on the watchers, cannot depend on a mountain's own nobility, and cannot depend on the mind's ability to solve what has been heard. Rest comes more gently, when what is too large for us is left inside a greater keeping than our own. So let the mountain be kept. Let the old sorrow be kept. Let the remembered height be kept. Let the names and the warnings and the cold stars all be kept where your tired hands do not have to carry them any farther tonight. This is not neglect. It is trust. Trust that truth remains true without your vigilance. Trust that the story remains itself when you close your eyes. Trust that God does not sleep when you do. For some listeners, this may be the deepest rest of all. Not merely that the mountain is distant, but that it is no longer theirs to manage. Hermon can stand inside the dark as part of a world still governed beyond rebellion. The oath was real, but it was not ultimate. The shadow spread, but it was not ultimate. The sentence stood, but even judgment belongs to a wisdom larger than our tired thinking. When the mind remembers that, its grip begins to loosen naturally. So if the ridgeline is now only faint, let it be faint. If the stars are only a few small points, let them be only points. If the wind is no longer a sound, but only the idea of coolness passing somewhere far away, let that be enough. Enough is holy at this hour. Enough is restful. Enough lets the body receive the night instead of negotiating with it. Perhaps you can imagine the whole scene now in the simplest possible way. A dark mountain beneath a dark sky. A little silver at the edge of the stars. The lower world hidden. The old story quiet. God awake. That is sufficient. Nothing more needs to be added. Nothing more needs to be defended. Nothing more needs to be carried uphill in thought. If a final feeling remains, let it be this. The world is larger than the rebellion that wounded it. Larger than the leader who spoke the oath. Larger than the fear that gathered others around him. Larger than the long shadow of corrupted gifts. Larger than the inward ache of regret. Larger even than the sentence that exposed the whole structure. Night reveals that largeness gently. It hides the details that strain us and leaves only enough form for reverence. And reverence, at the end, can become rest. Not by becoming cheerful, by becoming quiet, by kneeling without effort, by letting what is solemn remain solemn without demanding another response. If your breathing is slow now, let it stay slow. If your eyes are heavy, let them remain heavy. If the mind has already begun loosening its hold on the ridge, do not tighten it again out of duty. You have kept enough watch for one night. You have stood near enough to hear. You have followed the mountain far enough. Now, let the night take over where your attention leaves off. Let it cover the slopes. Let it deepen the valleys. Let it thin the stars into quiet points. Let it place the whole story farther out, where it can remain true and yet no longer press against your rest. There is a kind of mercy in endings that do not attempt to force brightness. This story does not become cheerful at the last moment, and that is part of why it can truly soothe. False brightness would ask the soul to pretend. Night asks for less. It asks only that what is true be left where it is, and that what is weary be allowed to rest beneath it. Hermon can remain solemn. The old warning can remain solemn. The memory of Semyaza's regret can remain solemn. Yet beneath all that solemnity, the listener may still be carried gently toward sleep. Because sleep does not require that every heavy thing become light. Sometimes, it requires only that every heavy thing be placed in hands larger than ours. And if the mind tries once more to return to the ridge, answer it kindly. Yes, the ridge remains. Yes, the story remains. Yes, the mountain still bears its remembered gravity, but not now, not any farther tonight. The night has already given enough room for truth, enough room for reverence, enough room for warning, enough room for distance. Let that enough protect you from one more cycle of effort. Let it tell the mind that wakeful labor is finished. Let it tell the heart that nothing faithful is being abandoned by sleep. What has been heard may now be entrusted, and what is entrusted may finally rest beyond your reach. Perhaps this is the gentlest image of all. Not you keeping watch over Hermon, but the night itself keeping watch while you sleep. The stars remain where they are. The mountain remains where it is. God remains who He is. And you are allowed to become small again, not in fear, but in peace. Small enough to stop thinking in ridgelines and sentences. Small enough to receive the humble blessing of a single breath. Then another, until even the idea of the mountain begins to blur into simple darkness. There is one final gentleness in leaving Hermon to the night. What is distant can be blessed without being grasped. You do not have to understand every shadow on the mountain to leave it in peace. You do not have to solve every thread of regret to stop carrying it actively. Blessing at the end of a dark story is often just this: a quiet willingness to let what is solemn remain solemn in God's keeping, while the soul steps back from it without fear. That is a holy kind of release. It is not forgetfulness, and it is not indifference. It is the trust that what matters most does not depend on your continued effort at this hour. And because the mountain is no longer near, the room around you may begin to matter again in a softer way. The bed beneath you, the blanket, the dimness at the edge of the walls, the familiar stillness of ordinary shelter. After so much height and cold air and remembered distance, ordinary shelter can feel almost sacramental. A simple room, honestly received, becomes its own answer to restless grandeur. You are here. You are safe enough to rest. The mountain is there. The night is wide enough for both. No further crossing is required. If prayer is near, let it be a short prayer, not a striving prayer, not a prayer that tries to reopen all that has already been spoken. Only a small prayer fitted to the hour, that what is true may remain true, that what is heavy may be held, that what is weary may sleep, and that what belongs to morning may wait for morning. Such a prayer does not lengthen the night. It gently hands the night back to God. And when even that last thought grows tired, let it loosen. Let the mountain stay in the distance. Let the room stay quiet. Let the night do its patient work. Sleep does not need a final argument. It only needs a soul willing to be small, sheltered, and gently carried where words no longer ask to be followed, defended, or answered tonight alone. And if one final blessing may be spoken over this dark and distant mountain, let it be a blessing of release. May what is too high be held by higher hands. May what is too old be kept in wiser memory. May what is too heavy be laid down for the night. May what is still unresolved remain safely unresolved until morning. May the body receive the mercy of not having to finish anything now. May the mind accept the gentleness of enough. May the breath move without effort. May the bed feel simple. May the room feel sheltered. May the soul loosen its small defenses. And may the mountain, far off beneath the cold stars, remain where it belongs, while sleep comes nearer than thought. Good night, dear pilgrim. The ridge is distant now. The sky is wide. The dark is kind. You may rest